I'm Harris Costa, 68. A retired Army veteran who spent 30 years serving my country before settling into what I thought would be peaceful golden years. Last Thanksgiving, as my family gathered round the dinner table I'd set with my late wife's, China, my son Marcus looked me dead in the eye and called me a worthless old soldier in front of his children. The words hit harder than any enemy fire I'd faced in 2 tours overseas. But Marcus had no idea what he'd just unleashed. You see, hanging on my bedroom wall was something he'd coveted for years, my Purple Heart, earned with blood and sacrifice, in a place he'd never understand. What I did with that medal in the days that followed would teach him the true meaning of respect, honor, and the price of taking family for granted. If you've ever felt dismissed by those who should honor you, most you'll want to hear this story. Asterisk, I'd been preparing for Thanksgiving since dawn, the way Margaret taught me 43 years ago, when we were newlyweds in our tiny apartment outside Fort Bragg. Every detail mattered to her: the table setting, the way the napkins folded, the precise timing of the turkey so it would emerge golden and perfect just as our guests arrived. Even now, 15 years after losing her to cancer, I still followed her traditions to the letter. The dining room table gleamed under the overhead light, dressed in Margaret's white lace tablecloth that she'd inherited from her grandmother. I'd carefully arranged her good china, the delicate blue and white pattern, with tiny roses that she'd saved up for month by month during our early years. Each piece told a story of sacrifice and love, purchased one at a time whenever we had an extra $20. She'd been so proud of that set, how it transformed our humble table into something elegant for special occasions. The turkey had been brining since Tuesday, seasoned with Margaret's secret blend of herbs that I still mix by hand every November. Sweet potato casserole, cooling on the counter. Green bean almondine, waiting in the warming drawer. And her famous cornbread stuffing that Marcus used to beg for as a child. Everything exactly as she would have done it. At 68, cooking for 6 people was more challenging than it used to be. My arthritic hands struggled with the can opener, and I'd had to take breaks between stirring the gravy and mashing the potatoes. But this was important. Family was supposed to be everything, and after Margaret died, these gatherings were all I had left of the life we'd built together. Marcus arrived first with Jennifer and the kids, Sma, 12, and little David, 8. My heart lifted seeing them pile out of their BMW arms full of store-bought pies and wine. Emma had grown so tall since last Christmas, all legs and braces, while David still had that gap-toothed grin that reminded me so much of Marcus at that age. Smells incredible in here, Dad, Marcus said, giving me a quick, distracted hug. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd never known real hardship. His law practice was thriving. Jennifer's real estate business was booming. And they lived in a house 3 times the size of the one where I'd raised him on a construction worker's salary. Jennifer kissed my cheek, her attention already elsewhere. Harris, you really didn't need to go to all this trouble. We could have just ordered from that new place on Main Street. The comment stung, though I tried not to show it. This wasn't trouble, this was tradition. Love made tangible in every carefully prepared dish. But I smiled and ushered them into the living room, where David immediately spotted the framed photos on the mantelpiece. Grandpa, is this you in your soldier uniform? He asked, pointing to my army portrait from 1976. It sure is, buddy. That was taken right before I shipped out to Germany. Were you a hero? Emma asked, rolling her eyes at her brother's enthusiasm, but unable to hide her own curiosity. I was about to answer when Marcus cut in. Grandpa was just doing his job. Kids, nothing special about it. The words hit like a slap, casual and dismissive. Nothing special. 30 years of service, 2 tours in dangerous places. The Purple Heart hanging in my bedroom upstairs, nothing special. Dinner started pleasantly enough. The turkey was perfect, golden and moist, and even Jennifer complimented the stuffing. David chatted about school and his soccer team, while Emma told us about her role in the school play. For a moment, it felt like the family gatherings Margaret had always dreamed of. Then the conversation turned to Marcus's latest case. Some corporate merger that would net his firm a 6-figure commission. He spoke with the easy arrogance of someone who'd never doubted his own importance, never questioned whether his work actually mattered in the grand scheme of things. It's all about leverage, he explained to Jennifer, though she'd heard the story before. Knowing what people want and making them pay for it. I found myself thinking about leverage, about what I'd wanted at his age. Not money or prestige, but purpose. The chance to serve something bigger than myself. To protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The army had given me that, and Morit had given me brothers, men who'd die for each other without hesitation. Remember, when you wanted to enlist, Marcus Tice said quietly, cutting into my turkey. Right after high school, you talked about serving your country. His fork paused, halfway to his mouth. That was kid stuff, Dad. I grew up, got smart, went to college instead of wasting my life playing soldier. The room went quiet. Even the children sensed the shift in atmosphere. Jennifer's eyes darted between us, and I could see her preparing to smooth things over with some cheerful change of subject. But I couldn't let it go. Not this time. Playing soldier, I asked, my voice steady, despite the fire building in my chest. Is that what you think I did for 30 years? Dad, come on, Marcus said, taking a large gulp of wine. You followed orders, collected a paycheck, got your little pension. It's not like you saved the world or anything. That's when he said, it, the words that would change everything between us forever. You're just a worthless old soldier who never amounted to anything. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's mouth fell open. David looked confused, and Jennifer stared at her plate as if she could disappear into it. The grandmother clock in the hallway ticked loudly, marking the seconds as those words settled into the space between us like poison. I set down my fork carefully, the same way I'd learned to handle my weapon in combat, with deliberate, controlled precision. My hands weren't shaking, though they should have been. Something inside me had gone very still, very calm, the way it used to before a mission. I think, I said quietly, it's time for you to leave. The house felt impossibly quiet after they left. No sound of children's laughter, no clatter of dishes, no conversation, just the hollow echo of those words bouncing off the walls. Worthless old soldier. I sat at the dining room table for a long time, staring at the half-eaten plates of food that had taken me hours to prepare. Margaret's china seemed to mock me now. Each delicate piece, a reminder of traditions that apparently meant nothing to my son. The turkey sat cooling in its platter, the stuffing congealing. The carefully timed meal reduced to leftovers that would feed only me for the next week. I finally stood and began clearing the table, muscle memory taking over where my mind had gone numb. Load the dishwasher, wrap the turkey, store the sides in containers that would crowd my refrigerator with the evidence of my foolish hope. The mechanical nature of cleanup gave me something to focus on besides the growing ache in my chest. When the kitchen was finally clean, I climbed the stairs to my bedroom, each step feeling heavier than the last. My knees protested 68 years of wear and tear, including that shrapnel that still shifted in my left leg when the weather changed. The same shrapnel that had earned me the Purple Heart hanging on my bedroom wall. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it, the distinctive purple ribbon, the gold-trimmed heart with Washington's profile in the center. It had been presented to me in a sterile army hospital in Germany, pinned to my chest by a colonel whose name I'd forgotten. What I hadn't forgotten was the weight of it. Not just the physical weight of the metal, but everything it represented. The citation was framed beside it, for military merit and for wounds received in action against an enemy of the United States. Such formal language for such an informal moment, diving into enemy fire to pull Jimmy Rodriguez out of a collapsed bunker. Taking shrapnel in my leg and back, with the second round of mortar hit. Jimmy had made it home to his wife and 3 kids in El Paso. I still got Christmas cards from his family. Photos of grandchildren I'd never meet, but who existed because I'd acted without thinking when it mattered. That's what soldiers do, we act when others can't or won't. I reached into my closet and pulled out my old combat boots, the leather cracked and worn but still holding their shape. Margaret had wanted me to throw them away years ago, said they were taking up space and collecting dust. But she understood when I explained that they weren't just boots, they were a reminder of who I'd been, what I'd done when it mattered. The boots had walked through mud and blood, had carried me across terrain where one wrong step could mean death. They'd been on my feet when I'd held dying friends, when I'd written letters to mothers who would never see their sons again, when I'd stood at attention for flags draped over coffins. Worthless. The word echoed in my mind as I held those boots. Tell that to Jimmy Rodriguez's kids. Tell that to the families of the men whose bodies I'd helped carry home. Tell that to the young soldiers I'd trained. The ones who'd survived because I'd taught them how to stay alive in impossible situations. I'd come home from my second tour to find Marcus, then 15, had changed. The respectful boy who'd hugged me goodbye had been replaced by a teenager who barely looked up from his video games when I walked through the door. Margaret had tried to explain he'd been hurt by my absence, confused by having a father who chose strangers in foreign countries over basketball games and school plays. I'd tried to reconnect, tried to share stories that might help him understand. But Marcus had already decided that his father was someone to be embarrassed by. Someone whose friends' dads had real jobs that didn't involve sleeping in tents and eating MREs. By the time he left for college, the distance between us felt unbridgeable. But Margaret had been the bridge, always finding ways to bring us together. She'd insist Marcus call me on my birthday, would send him care packages from both of us during finals week, would somehow make him show up for the important moments, even when he clearly didn't want to be there. After she died, even that thin connection had frayed. Marcus attended the funeral, of course, stood by my side as we watched them lower her casket into the ground. But even then, he'd seemed impatient, checking his phone, whispering to Jennifer about when they could leave. I'd tried to understand. Maybe it was easier for him to dismiss me than to admit he might actually need his old man. Maybe success had come so easily to him that he couldn't comprehend what it meant to fight for something, to earn respect through service rather than demand it through achievement. But those explanations felt hollow now. At 68, I was tired of making excuses for my son's behavior, tired of pretending that his casual cruelty was just awkwardness, that his dismissal of my service was just generational difference. The Purple Heart caught the light from my bedside lamp, the gold gleaming against the purple ribbon. I'd earned this medal with blood and sacrifice, had been judged worthy of it by men who understood the cost of service. It represented the best of what I'd been: brave, selfless, committed to something larger than myself. Maybe that was the problem. Marcus had never had to be brave, never had to put himself at risk for others. His battles were fought in boardrooms with expensive lawyers, his victories measured in billable hours and client retainers. He'd never had to look into the eyes of a dying friend and promise to tell his mother how much he loved her. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where porch lights were coming on in the gathering dusk. Other families were probably settling in after their own Thanksgiving celebrations, discussing Christmas plans and upcoming visits. Normal families who respected each other, who understood that love meant more than just showing up. The weight of loneliness settled over me like a familiar coat. This was my life now: holidays spent cooking for people who saw my efforts as unnecessary, my service as meaningless, my presence as something to be endured rather than cherished. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, something else began to grow alongside the loneliness. It started as a small flame of anger, fed by years of swallowed insults and dismissed accomplishments. It grew warmer as I thought about all the times I'd bitten my tongue, all the moments I'd chosen peace over confrontation. Margaret would have wanted me to forgive, to be the bigger person, to find a way to rebuild the bridge that Marcus kept burning. But Margaret wasn't here to see how far our son had fallen, how thoroughly he'd rejected everything we'd tried to teach him about respect and honor. The Purple Heart seemed to pulse in the lamplight, reminding me that I'd once been a man who took action when action was needed. I'd once been someone who fought for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Maybe it was time to remember who that man had been. The memories came flooding back as I held my old combat boots, triggered by the familiar scent of worn leather and the weight of dismissal that felt too much like the homecoming I'd received decades earlier. Vietnam had been my first tour, and coming home from that war had taught me what it meant to be called worthless by people who had never faced what we faced. But this hurt more. This was my son. I set the boots aside and opened my dresser drawer, pulling out a photograph I rarely looked at anymore. 7 young faces stared back at me, arms draped over each other's shoulders, trying to look tough despite the exhaustion. In their eyes, 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company, somewhere in the Central Highlands in 1972. I was 21 in that photo, barely older than Emma is now, but the man looking back at me seemed ancient even then. Of those 7 men, only 3 came home, and of those 3, I was the only one still alive. Tony Valdez, second from the left, had stepped on a mine 2 weeks after this photo was taken. There hadn't been enough left of him to send home in a proper coffin. Danny Morrison, no relation to Jake, though the name would prove significant, later had taken a sniper's bullet through the chest during a routine patrol. He'd died calling for his mother, and I'd held his hand until the medics arrived too late. But it was Jimmy Rodriguez who haunted me most. 4th from the right in the photo, grinning despite the mud caked on his uniform. Jimmy, who carried pictures of his 3 little girls in his helmet and talked about teaching them to fish when he got home. Jimmy, who'd been trapped in that bunker when the mortar started falling, and who'd be dead if I hadn't acted without thinking. The attack had come at dawn, the way they always did. We'd been fortifying a hilltop position when the first rounds started falling, turning our quiet morning into chaos. The bunker Jimmy was working in took a direct hit, the timber roof collapsing and pinning him inside with what looked like half the mountain on top of him. I could still hear him calling my name through the wreckage, his voice growing weaker as smoke began pouring from the collapsed structure. The logical thing would have been to wait for the engineers to clear the area and approach the rescue systematically. But Jimmy was running out of time, and logic was a luxury we couldn't afford. I'd crawled through the debris on my belly, following the sound of his voice, ignoring the ongoing mortar fire that was walking closer to our position. The timber that had him pinned was massive, and I'd had to use a piece of rebar as a lever to lift it enough for him to squeeze out. That's when the second wave hit. The explosion threw both of us back against the bunker wall, and I felt the sharp bite of shrapnel tearing through my left leg and embedding itself in my back. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but Jimmy was moving, and that was all that mattered. The medics found us 20 minutes later, after the barrage finally stopped. Jimmy had a broken arm and some cuts, but he was alive. I was bleeding from multiple wounds, my leg barely functional, but I was grinning like a fool because we'd both made it out. The Purple Heart ceremony had been held in a German hospital 3 weeks later. After they'd picked the last pieces of metal out of my back, the colonel who presented it, Colonel Harrison, I remembered now, had read the citation in a crisp military voice that made it sound almost routine. But he'd looked me in the eye afterward and said something that stayed with me. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Sergeant Costa. It's acting in spite of fear for something bigger than yourself. Jimmy had recovered fully and gone home to El Paso, where he'd taught his daughters to fish, just like he'd promised. He'd sent photos over the years, the girls growing up, getting married, having children of their own. When he'd died of cancer in 1998, his oldest daughter had written to tell me that he'd talked about that day in the bunker until the end. How Sergeant Costa had saved his life and made everything else possible. Something bigger than yourself. That's what service had always meant to me, the understanding that some things were worth risking everything for. Country, certainly, but more than that. The idea that when everything fell apart, someone had to step forward. Someone had to be willing to crawl through the wreckage to pull others to safety. I'd carried that understanding home from Vietnam, through a second tour in Germany, through 30 years of military service that had taken me away from baseball games and school plays and all the small moments that Marcus had held against me. I'd carried it into civilian life, into construction work where safety meant watching out for your crew, into fatherhood where I'd tried to teach my son that real strength meant protecting others. But somewhere along the way, the lesson had been lost. Marcus had grown up in comfort and safety, never having to test himself against real hardship. He'd learned to take rather than give, to demand rather than earn, to dismiss what he didn't understand rather than try to comprehend the sacrifice behind it. The shrapnel in my leg chose that moment to remind me of its presence. A sharp twinge that made me shift position on the bed. Weather was changing, it always did this time of year, and my body had become an accurate barometer of approaching storms. I thought about Margaret, how she'd massage my leg on the bad nights when the metal fragments seemed to move and press against nerves. She'd never complained about being married to a man whose body carried the permanent evidence of someone else's war. She'd understood, even when Marcus didn't, that those scars were proof of something important. The Purple Heart caught my eye, again, hanging on the wall like a reminder of who I'd once been. In that German hospital, recovering from wounds earned saving a friend's life, I'd felt proud of that medal. I'd felt worthy of it. It represented the best version of myself, the man who acted when action was needed, who put others before himself, who understood that some things were worth bleeding for. But what did it represent now, hanging on the wall of a lonely old man, whose own son called him worthless, collecting dust while the values it embodied were dismissed as outdated and meaningless? I stood and walked closer to the medal, remembering the weight of it when Colonel Harrison had pinned it to my hospital gown. The Purple Heart isn't given for heroism. That's what the Medal of Honor and Silver Star are for. It's given for sacrifice, for bleeding in service of something larger than yourself, for paying a price that most people will never be asked to pay. Marcus had never bled for anything, except paper cuts from legal briefs. He'd never put himself at risk for another person, never chosen duty over comfort, never understood that respect is something you earn through sacrifice rather than demand through success. Maybe that was the problem. The medal hanging on my wall meant nothing to him because he'd never done anything to deserve understanding its value. To him, it was just a piece of metal, a participation trophy for playing soldier in wars he'd never bothered to learn about. But there were others who would understand. Other veterans who'd bled and sacrificed, who'd earned the right to judge whether my service had been worthless. Men and women who'd crawled through their own wreckage to save their own Jimmy Rodriguez's, who carried their own shrapnel and their own memories of friends who didn't make it home. The idea began to form, slowly, like dawn breaking over a battlefield. If Marcus couldn't understand the value of what hung on my wall, maybe it was time to give it to someone who could. Someone who'd earned the right to appreciate what it represented. Who'd understand that it wasn't just a medal, but a promise that sacrifice matters, that courage counts, that some things are worth bleeding for. I thought about the veterans I'd met at the VA hospital during my physical therapy sessions after Margaret died. Young men and women carrying wounds from Iraq and Afghanistan, struggling with the same readjustment issues I'd faced 40 years earlier. Some of them had families who supported them, who understood their service and honored their sacrifice. Others weren't so lucky. Others had families who saw their injuries as inconveniences, their nightmares as weakness, their service as a phase they should just get over and move past. Maybe one of those deserving veterans should have my Purple Heart. Maybe it was time to put it where it would be valued, understood, and honored the way it deserved to be. The decision crystallized in my mind, like ice forming on a winter pond slowly at first. Then all at once with absolute clarity. If my son thought my service was worthless, then he'd forfeited any right to inherit the proof of that service. The Purple Heart would go to someone who understood its true value. Someone who'd paid their own price for the right to wear it. For the first time since Marcus had spoken those cruel words, I felt something other than hurt and anger. I felt purpose. I met Margaret in 1975 at a diner in Jacksonville, North Carolina, 6 months after I'd returned from my first tour. She was working the night shift to put herself through nursing school, and I was just another soldier trying to figure out how to be a civilian again. The transition wasn't going well. The nightmares were the worst part. I'd wake up screaming Jimmy's name, drenched in sweat, convinced I could still hear mortar falling. Margaret had been patient in a way that most 22-year-old women wouldn't have been, holding me until the shaking stopped, talking me back to reality when the flashbacks hit. "You're home now," she'd whisper, her voice cutting through the fog of memory and fear. "You're safe. You're with me. Safe." It had taken me months to believe that word again, to trust that the world wasn't going to explode around me without warning. Margaret had been my anchor during those dark months, the steady presence that kept me tethered to a reality where people didn't die suddenly and violently, where loud noises were just loud noises and not incoming artillery. She'd worn a thin, gold band even then, though it hadn't been an engagement ring. It had belonged to her grandmother, a reminder of the family she'd lost in a car accident when she was 17. We'd bonded over her civilian grief and my military trauma, finding common ground in the understanding that life could change in an instant, that the people you loved could be taken away without warning. We were married in 1976, a small ceremony at the base chapel with a handful of friends as witnesses. Margaret had looked radiant in her simple white dress, the same gold band, now joined by a matching wedding ring that I'd saved up for during 3 months of eating nothing but peanut butter sandwiches and ramen noodles. Marcus was born in 1981, after we'd been trying for 3 years and had nearly given up hope. I'd been stationed at Fort Hood then, working my way up through the NCO ranks while Margaret finished her nursing degree. Through night classes and correspondence courses, money was tight and Army sergeant's pay didn't stretch far, especially with a baby butt. We were happy in a way that seems impossible now. I remember holding Marcus for the first time. This tiny, wrinkled creature who'd somehow grown from nothing into a person with his mother's dark eyes and what would eventually become his father's stubborn chin. The responsibility had been overwhelming. This perfect little human who depended on me for everything, who'd looked to me for guidance on how to be a man. Margaret had been the natural parent, intuitive in a way that made motherhood look effortless. She'd known when Marcus was hungry before he cried, could soothe him to sleep with a lullaby hummed in a voice like honey, seemed to understand his needs through some mysterious maternal connection that left me feeling clumsy and unnecessary. But I'd found my role too. I was the one who taught him to throw a baseball, who helped him build model airplanes on Saturday mornings, who read him bedtime stories about brave knights and noble adventures. When he'd wake up from a nightmare, it was often my voice he'd call for, my presence that could chase away the monsters hiding in his closet. The Army had been good to us in those early years. Base housing might have been cramped and ugly, but it was free, and we'd been surrounded by other young families facing the same challenges. There'd been barbecues and birthday parties. Kids running wild between identical houses, while their parents sat on lawn chairs and talked about everything except the work that took us away too often. When I'd gotten orders for Germany in 1985, Marcus had been 4 years old enough to understand that Daddy was going away, but too young to understand why. Margaret had stayed behind. She'd just gotten a good job at the base hospital, and we'd decided that stability was more important than keeping the family together for what was supposed to be a 12-month deployment. That 12 months had stretched to 18 when tensions escalated and my unit was extended. I'd missed Marcus's 5th birthday, his first day of kindergarten, his Christmas program, where he'd played a shepherd in the nativity play. Margaret had sent photos and videotapes, but they were poor substitutes for being there. When I'd finally come home, Marcus had been polite but distant, like I was a friendly stranger rather than his father. The easy intimacy we'd shared had been replaced by awkward formality. He'd call me sir instead of daddy, would ask Margaret's permission before doing things he'd once done without thinking. I'd tried to rebuild that connection, spending every free moment trying to recapture what we'd lost. But kids don't work that way. You can't make up for lost time with extra attention. Can't force affection that's been interrupted by absence. Margaret had been understanding, assuring me that it would get better, that children were resilient and love always found a way back. She'd been right, eventually. By the time Marcus turned 7, we'd found our rhythm again. I'd learned to treasure the time we had together, to make every moment count, because I never knew when the next deployment would come. We'd developed traditions: Saturday morning fishing trips, Thursday night ice cream runs, bedtime stories that I'd embellish with increasingly ridiculous details, until he'd collapse in giggles. But the damage had been done in ways I didn't understand at the time. Marcus had learned that his father was someone who left, someone whose promises came with unspoken caveats about duty and orders and things. More important than family dinners. He'd learned to protect himself by not depending too much on my presence, to find his security in his mother's constant love, rather than his father's inconsistent availability. Margaret had never complained, never made me feel guilty for choosing the army over family time. She'd understood that my service was part of who I was, that the man she'd fallen in love with was someone who believed in duty and honor and sacrifice for the greater good. But I could see the cost in her eyes sometimes, the weariness of being a single parent for months at a time, the loneliness of making decisions alone and celebrating achievements with only photos to send to an absent husband. When I'd made Sergeant Major in 1992, we'd celebrated with dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, all 3 of us dressed up. Marcus, awkward in a tie, but trying to look proud of his father's promotion. He'd been 11 then, old enough to understand that this was important, that the extra stripes on Daddy's sleeve meant recognition for work well done. "What does a sergeant major do?" he'd asked over dessert, genuine curiosity in his voice. "I take care of soldiers," I'd explained. "I make sure they have what they need to do their jobs, that they're trained and ready and safe. I'm responsible for their welfare. Like how Mum takes care of her patients." Exactly like that. Different kind of taking care, but the same idea: putting other people's needs ahead of your own. He'd nodded solemnly, seeming to file that information away for future consideration. For a moment, I'd allowed myself to hope that he might follow in my footsteps, that the army might give him the same sense of purpose and belonging it had given me. But as Marcus had gotten older, those moments of connection had become rarer. High school had brought new interest: friends whose fathers were doctors and lawyers and business owners. People who lived in houses instead of base quarters, who took vacations instead of reporting for duty. The gap between my world and his had widened with each passing year. Margaret had been the bridge between us, always finding ways to help Marcus see the honor in my service, the importance of the work I did. She'd talk about the young soldiers who'd come to our house for holiday dinners, kids far from home who'd found family in our kitchen. She'd remind him of the medals and commendations, the lives I'd helped save through training and leadership. When she'd gotten sick in 2005, everything had changed. The cancer had been aggressive, and the treatments had been brutal. I'd taken early retirement to care for her, trading my sergeant major stripes for the role of full-time caregiver. Marcus had been busy with law school then, visiting when he could, but absorbed in his own life, his own future. Margaret had died holding my hand. Her wedding ring, that same gold band she'd worn when we'd met, loose on her finger from the weight she'd lost. With her last coherent words, she'd made me promise to take care of Marcus, to find a way to bridge the gap that had grown between us. I'd tried to keep that promise. After the funeral, I'd reached out more, called more often, made more effort. to be part of his life. But Marcus had been climbing the ladder at his law firm, building the successful life that Margaret and I had sacrificed to make possible. My attempts at connection had been met with polite but distant responses, visits that felt obligatory rather than desired. Now, 15 years later, I could see how completely I'd failed to keep that promise. The son Margaret had loved so fiercely, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball and build model airplanes, had grown into a man who saw his father's service as something to be embarrassed by rather than proud of. Her wedding ring was still in my jewelry box. The gold dulled with age, but the circle still perfect. Sometimes I'd hold it and remember the woman who'd seen honor in my duty, who'd understood that loving a soldier meant sharing him with something larger than family, larger than self. She would have been heartbroken to hear Marcus's words at Thanksgiving dinner, but I thought she would have understood what I was planning to do in response. Margaret had always believed that respect was earned, not given, and that sometimes tough love was the only way to teach important lessons. If our son couldn't appreciate the value of sacrifice, maybe it was time to show him what loss really meant. Looking back, I could see how Marcus's sense of entitlement had grown slowly, fed by well-meaning praise and the natural desire of parents to give their child everything they'd never had. Margaret and I had both grown up with lesser family, lost in that car accident, my own parents struggling to make ends meet on a factory worker's salary. We'd wanted Marcus to feel secure in a way we never had. The Little League trophy still sat on a shelf in his old bedroom, gathering dust beside his participation ribbons and honor roll certificates. It was a modest thing, a plastic golden boy, frozen mid-swing, mounted on a marble base with an engraved plate that read Harris Costa, Most Improved Player, 1989. He'd been 8 years old, and Margaret had been so proud of that trophy that she'd called her sister long distance to share the news. But I remembered the season differently. Marcus had been on a team with 12 other kids, most of them more athletically gifted, many of them more dedicated to practice and improvement. He'd shown up when it was convenient, complained when the weather was hot, and spent most games watching clouds instead of focusing on the ball. The Most Improved Player award had been the coach's diplomatic way of recognizing a kid who'd gone from terrible to merely mediocre. But Margaret had treated it like he'd won the World Series, framing the team photo and hanging it in the living room next to my military "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," she'd said, hugging him tight while he basked in the attention. "You worked so hard this season." But he hadn't worked hard. That was the problem. Marcus had learned early that showing up was enough, that effort was optional, that praise would come regardless of actual achievement. Every parent wants to encourage their child, but somewhere along the way, our encouragement had become inflation. Our support had become enabling. School had followed the same pattern. Marcus was bright, there was no denying that, but he'd learned to coast on natural intelligence rather than develop work ethic. When he'd brought home a B+ on a test, Margaret would celebrate like it was an A. When he'd made the honor roll with the minimum GPA required, we'd taken him out for dinner and bought him the new video game he'd been wanting. I'd tried to push for higher standards, to suggest that good grades were expected rather than exceptional. But Margaret had always intervened with her gentle wisdom about building confidence and not crushing his spirit. She'd grown up with critical parents who'd never seemed satisfied with her accomplishments, and she was determined not to repeat their mistakes. "He's doing his best," she'd say when I'd suggest that Marcus could study harder, practice more, show more respect for authority. We need to support him, not tear him down. But was he doing his best? I'd seen what real effort looked like in young soldiers, kids who'd pushed themselves beyond their limits because they understood that lives might depend on their competence. I'd seen what dedication looked like when the stakes were real, when failure meant more than a disappointed parent or a lower grade. Marcus had never faced real stakes. His failures had been cushioned by our love, his mistakes explained away by our excuses, his shortcomings minimized by our desire to protect his self-esteem. We'd meant well, but we'd created a young man who expected praise for mediocrity and respect without earning it. The pattern had continued into high school. When Marcus had been caught cheating on a history exam, the teacher had been willing to let him retake it after Margaret had spoken with her about the stress he was under from college applications. When he'd re-rented another car while texting, we'd paid for the damage and increased his insurance without making him work to cover the costs. Each time, Margaret had found reasons to excuse his behavior. He was a good kid at heart, she'd argue. He was under pressure. He was learning from his mistakes. Everyone deserved second chances, and third chances, and fourth chances. I'd gone along with it because I'd loved her, because I'd wanted to be a good father. because I'd been away so much. During his childhood I'd felt guilty about being the disciplinarian when I was home. But I'd watched other military families, seen how children of career soldiers could turn out when they were held to higher standards, taught that actions had consequences, raised to understand that respect was earned through character and service. Those kids had grown up to be responsible adults who valued hard work and understood sacrifice. They'd joined the military themselves, or become teachers, or doctors, or found other ways to serve something larger than themselves. They'd inherited their parents' sense of duty along with their love. Marcus had inherited our love, but not our values. He'd learned to take without giving, to demand without earning, to expect the world to accommodate his desires rather than adapting himself to the world's demands. College had made it worse. We'd paid his tuition, his room and board, his spending money for 4 years, while he'd studied just enough to maintain his scholarship, and spent the rest of his time enjoying the freedom we'd purchased for him. When he'd called home, it was usually because he needed money or wanted to complain about a professor who'd given him a grade he didn't think he deserved. Law school had been more of the same, except more expensive. We'd co-signed loans, sent care packages, celebrated when he'd passed the bar exam, with a score that was respectable but not exceptional. Margaret had been so proud when he'd gotten his first job at a prestigious firm. Never mind that it was connections rather than merit that had opened the door. "He's going to do so well," she'd said, looking at the picture he'd sent of himself in his new suit, standing in front of the law firm's marble lobby. "All our sacrifices were worth it." Our sacrifices. That phrase had stuck with me, because it revealed how backwards we'd gotten things. Parents were supposed to sacrifice for their children, but children were also supposed to learn to sacrifice for others. We'd given Marcus everything, but we'd never taught him to give anything back. Even his choice of Jennifer had followed the pattern. She was beautiful, successful, from a good family, but she was also someone who'd been raised with the same sense of entitlement, the same expectation that the world owed her comfort and admiration. Together, they'd built a life based on acquisition rather than contribution, success rather than service. When Emma and David had been born, I'd hoped that fatherhood might change Marcus, might teach him something about putting others first. But he'd hired nannies and housekeepers and tutors, outsourcing the difficult parts of parenting while enjoying the easy pleasures of having children who adored him. He was a fun dad, I had to give him that. He'd take the kids to expensive restaurants and theme parks, buy them elaborate gifts for birthdays and holidays, show up for the school plays and soccer games when his schedule allowed. But I'd never seen him do the hard work of parenting, the discipline, the teaching of values, the patient explanation of why some things mattered more than others. Margaret's death had been a turning point, though not the one I'd hoped for. Thought that losing his mother might make Marcus appreciate family more, might help him understand how quickly the people you love could be taken away. Instead, it seemed to have freed him from the last person whose opinion he'd genuinely cared about. Without Margaret's gentle pressure to visit, to call, to maintain the family connections she'd worked so hard to preserve, Marcus had drifted even further away. He'd attended the funeral, helped with the arrangements, been appropriately somber and supportive. But once the immediate crisis had passed, he'd gone back to his busy life, treating me like an obligation rather than a father. The Thanksgiving dinner had been the culmination of years of accumulated disrespect, the final proof that all our love and sacrifice had produced a man who valued nothing but his own comfort and success. Marcus had looked at his father, a man who'd bled for his country, who'd worked construction for 30 years to provide for his family, who'd earned the respect of hundreds of soldiers over a career of honorable service, and seen someone worthless. Maybe that was the real tragedy. We'd tried so hard to give Marcus everything that we'd forgotten to give him the most important thing of all, the understanding that worth came from service, that respect came from sacrifice, that love meant more than just showing up when it was convenient. Margaret's wedding ring caught the light from my dresser lamp, reminding me of the woman who'd seen the best in everyone, who'd believed that love could overcome any obstacle. She'd loved Marcus unconditionally, but she'd also expected him to become a man worthy of that love. Now, sitting in the bedroom we'd shared for 28 years, I had to face the painful truth that our good intentions had produced a son who saw his father as nothing more than an aging inconvenience. All the trophies and certificates and achievements we'd celebrated had added up to a man who couldn't recognize sacrifice when it was hanging on his father's wall. But maybe it wasn't too late for Marcus to learn. Maybe losing something he'd always assumed would be his something he'd never bothered to understand or appreciate might finally teach him the difference between earning respect and expecting it. The Purple Heart seemed to glow in the lamplight, waiting for someone who would understand its true value. The signs had been there for years, building like storm clouds on the horizon, while I'd chosen to look the other way. Last Father's Day, I'd found the card I'd bought for myself still sitting on my kitchen counter 3 days later, unopened. I'd purchased it at the grocery store, signed Marcus's name and the kids' names in my own handwriting, and left it where I'd see it every morning with my coffee. That sounds pathetic when I admit it now, but at the time it had seemed like a harmless fiction. Better to pretend my son had remembered than to face the reality that Father's Day meant nothing to him. The card had been generic, to a great dad with a picture of fishing gear on the front, but I'd read it anyway, letting myself believe, for a few minutes, that someone appreciated what I'd tried to be. The pattern of neglect had become so familiar that I'd stopped noticing it. The way you stop hearing the hum of an air conditioner after a while. Missed phone calls that were never returned. Promises to visit that were postponed indefinitely. Christmas gifts that arrived weeks late, with generic cards clearly selected by assistants. 3 months ago, Marcus had called asking to borrow money, not a lot by his standards, $5,000 to cover some unexpected expenses, while waiting for a client payment to come through. He'd been casual about it, confident in the way people are when they're certain of getting what they want. It's just temporary, Dad. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I'll pay you back with interest. I'd transferred the money the same day, the way I always did when my family needed help. $5,000 was a significant chunk of my pension and social security, but Marcus was my son, and wasn't that what family money was for? 6 weeks later, when the money still hadn't been returned, I'd called to ask about it. Marcus had been annoyed by the question, as if my concern about my own money was somehow inappropriate. Jesus, Dad, you sound like a collection agency. I said I'd pay you back, didn't I? The client is being slow, but the money's coming. You act like I'm trying to steal from you. The money had eventually been returned, 2 months late and without the promised interest. No explanation, no apology. Just a bank transfer with a memo line that read loan repayment, as if it were a business transaction, rather than a favor between father and son. But what had hurt more than the late payment was the assumption behind it, that my money was available whenever he needed it. That my time and resources existed primarily to serve his convenience. He'd never asked about my finances. Never wondered if lending him $5,000 might strain my budget or force me to postpone my own plans. The assumption of entitlement had shown up in smaller ways too. When he'd visited last Christmas, he'd brought his laundry, for loads of expensive clothes, that he'd dumped in my washer, without asking. When I'd questioned it, he'd seemed genuinely surprised by my objection. I figured you weren't doing anything else, he'd said, as if my time was valueless. My life empty of purpose or activity. When Jennifer had complained about the heat in my house, Marcus had suggested I install central air conditioning, volunteering my money and effort as if they were his to spend. When David had wanted to swim, Marcus had wondered aloud why I didn't have a pool, as if my backyard existed primarily for his children's entertainment. The most painful incident had happened just 2 months ago. During one of their rare visits, Emma had been working on a school project about family history, and she'd asked me to tell her about my time in the army. I'd been thrilled finally, a chance to share something meaningful with my granddaughter, to help her understand where she'd come from and what her family had sacrificed for freedom. I'd pulled out my photo albums, the carefully preserved pictures from Vietnam and Germany, the certificates and commendations that told the story of 30 years of honorable service. Emma had been genuinely interested, asking thoughtful questions about the uniforms and the medals, listening with the kind of attention that made my heart swell with grandfather's pride. Then Marcus had interrupted, glancing at his watch with obvious impatience. Okay, that's enough history for one day, he'd said, closing the photo album before I'd finished explaining the significance of my unit patch. Emma, why don't you go ask Grandma Jennifer about her family instead? She has some interesting stories about her ancestors who came over on the Mayflower. The dismissal had been casual, almost absent-minded, but it had cut deep. My stories weren't interesting enough to hold his attention. My service wasn't significant enough to merit his daughter's time. My history was something to be endured, rather than honored, hurried past rather than explored. Emma had looked confused by her father's interruption, but she'd obediently moved on to other topics. I'd closed the photo album and put it away, telling myself it didn't matter, that Marcus was just being protective of his daughter's time. but I'd seen the pattern repeated too often to pretend it was anything other than disrespect. There had been the time he'd answered his phone during my 68th birthday dinner, conducting a business call while I sat across from him waiting for him to finish, the time he'd criticized my driving and suggested I might be too old to be safe behind the wheel, the time he'd joked about putting me in a nursing home where I'd have people my own age to talk to. Each incident by itself might have been forgiven, explained away as stress or distraction or generational misunderstanding, but taken together, they painted a picture of a man who saw his father as a burden rather than a blessing, an obligation rather than an opportunity. The worst part was how I'd enabled it, how I'd made excuses and swallowed my hurt and pretended that his behavior was normal. I'd told myself that he was busy, that his job was stressful, that modern families were just different from the way things used to be. I'd accepted crumbs of attention and been grateful for them, afraid that demanding more might drive him away entirely. But Thanksgiving had changed something in me. Sitting at that dinner table, surrounded by the evidence of my love and effort, Margaret's good china, the perfectly cooked meal, the traditions I'd maintained, despite his obvious lack of interest, and hearing him dismiss my entire life's work as worthless, I'd finally seen the truth. I wasn't a father to Marcus anymore. I was a convenience, someone who could be counted on to provide money when needed, babysitting when requested, holiday dinners when expected. But I wasn't someone whose feelings mattered, whose history was worth preserving, whose sacrifices deserved recognition. Realization should have been devastating, but instead it was oddly liberating. If Marcus couldn't see my value, couldn't appreciate what I'd given and sacrificed and earned, then maybe it was time to stop offering those things to him. Maybe it was time to find someone who would understand what it meant to serve something larger than yourself. Someone who would value the Purple Heart for what it represented rather than dismiss it as meaningless metal. Margaret's photo smiled at me from the dresser, frozen in time at age 45, before the cancer, before the pain of watching our son become someone we didn't recognize. She'd believed in second chances, in the power of love to change hearts and heal wounds. But some lessons could only be learned through loss. Some people only recognized value when it was taken away from them. If Marcus thought I was worthless, then he'd forfeited any claim to the proof of my worth. The Purple Heart would go to someone who understood sacrifice, someone who'd earned the right to be honored, rather than someone who expected to inherit honor without effort. For the first time in months, I felt like the man I'd once been: decisive, purposeful, ready to take action when action was needed. The time for making excuses was over. The time for enabling disrespect had passed. It was time to show my son what loss really meant. The house felt different in the days following Thanksgiving, charged with an energy I hadn't felt in years. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was purposeful, pregnant with possibility. I'd made a decision, and decisions had always been my strength, even when they were difficult ones. I found myself drawn to Margaret's journal, the leather-bound book where she'd recorded her thoughts during the last months of her life. I'd avoided reading it for years after her death, afraid of what I might find, afraid that her private thoughts might reveal disappointments or regrets that would be too painful to bear. But now, needing her wisdom and guidance more than ever, I opened it carefully and began to read her familiar handwriting. The neat cursive that had filled out thousands of forms and written countless letters over our decades together. Harris came home today, exhausted from dealing with a problem soldier who'd been drinking and fighting in town. Read one entry from 2003. He spent 3 hours with the boy, talking him through his problems, helping him see that his anger was really grief over losing his father. That's what makes Harris such a good leader. He sees the person behind the problem, the pain behind the behavior. I wish Marcus understood that his father's compassion is strength, not weakness. Another entry, from later that same year. Marcus called today, complaining about his roommate and his professors and his workload. He seems to think that problems are things that happen to him rather than challenges to overcome. I worry that we've made life too easy for him, that he's never had to develop the resilience that comes from real hardship. Harris says I'm being too hard on him. But I see the difference between Marcus and the young soldiers who come to our house for dinner. Those boys have learned to fight for what they want. Our son expects it to be given to him. The words hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had seen the problem years before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. She'd recognized the danger in our well-intentioned coddling, the way our love had become enabling rather than empowering. I turned the page and found an entry that made my breath catch. Watched Harris teaching Marcus to change a tire today. Marcus got frustrated after 5 minutes, and wanted to call AAA instead of learning to do it himself. Harris was patient, kept showing him the steps, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. He wants so badly to pass on what he knows, to teach Marcus to be self-sufficient and capable, but Marcus just wants the easy way, the path that requires no effort or discomfort. How do you teach someone to value struggle when they've never had to struggle? The next entry was even more revealing. Had lunch with Sarah Morrison today. Her son Jake enlisted last month, and she's terrified but also proud. At least I know the army will teach him things I couldn't, she said. He'll learn what he's capable of, learn to push through when things get hard. I found myself envying her. Marcus will graduate college without ever being tested, without ever discovering his own strength. Is that really the gift we thought we were giving him? Morrison. The name resonated strangely, though I couldn't immediately place why. Sarah Morrison had been one of Margaret's friends from the Base Wives Club, but I hadn't thought about her in years. Her son Jake would be about 30 now, old enough to have served in Iraq or Afghanistan if he'd stayed in the military. I kept reading, drawn deeper into Margaret's thoughts about family and duty and the lessons we try to pass to our children. Her words revealed a woman who'd struggled with the same questions that haunted me now, who'd seen the dangers in our parenting choices, but hadn't known how to change course without seeming cruel or uncaring. Harris got his Purple Heart today. Read an entry from 1978, back when we were young and still learning how to be married. He's embarrassed by the ceremony, doesn't think he did anything special, but I've heard the story from his platoon leader. How he crawled through enemy fire to save Jimmy Rodriguez. How he refused medical attention until he knew Jimmy was safe. That medal represents everything I love about my husband, his willingness to sacrifice for others, his instinctive courage, his complete lack of selfishness. Someday our children will understand how lucky they are to have a father like that. Our children. Margaret had always planned on having more babies, a house full of kids who would benefit from Harris's example and her nurturing. Cancer had stolen that dream, along with so many others, leaving Marcus as our only legacy. Our single chance to pass on the values we'd held dear. Reading her words now, I could see how completely we'd failed in that mission. Marcus had grown up with a hero for a father and learned nothing about heroism. He'd been raised by a woman who understood sacrifice and learned nothing about selflessness. All our efforts, all our love, all our hopes had produced a man who could look at his father's service record and see only worthlessness. But Margaret's journal offered something else, true absolution for what I was planning to do. In her private thoughts, she'd revealed her own frustrations with Marcus's sense of entitlement, her own concerns about the man he was becoming. She'd loved him unconditionally, but she'd also seen clearly who he was becoming. Sometimes love means letting people face consequences, she'd written after Marcus had been arrested for underage drinking in college. Harris wanted to fly out there and fix everything, hire lawyers and smooth things over. But maybe Marcus needs to sit in that jail cell for a night. Needs to understand that actions have results. We've protected him from so much, but protection can become imprisonment if it keeps someone from growing. We'd bailed him out, of course. Margaret's wisdom had been overruled by parental panic, her tough love replaced by our familiar pattern of rescue and enabling. But her words rang true now, years later. As I contemplated the most difficult decision of my parenting life. If Marcus couldn't appreciate the Purple Heart, maybe he needed to lose it to understand its value. If he couldn't respect the sacrifice it represented, maybe he needed to see it given to someone who would honor it properly. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do for someone was to stop protecting them from the consequences of their choices. The decision crystallized as I sat there reading Margaret's words, her wisdom reaching across the years to guide me one last time. The Purple Heart hanging on my wall wasn't just a medal, it was a symbol of everything I'd tried to teach Marcus about service and sacrifice and the things worth fighting for. He'd rejected those lessons, dismissed them as the ramblings of a worthless old soldier. But maybe there was someone else out there who would understand. Someone who'd earned the right to appreciate what that medal meant. Someone like Jake Morrison, Sarah's son, who'd learned about sacrifice the hard way in places where courage wasn't optional and heroism was measured in blood and sweat and the willingness to put others first. I closed Margaret's journal and looked up at the Purple Heart, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time in years. It wasn't Marcus's inheritance. It was a sacred trust, a responsibility that could only be passed to someone worthy of carrying it forward. And Marcus had proven, with his cruel words and casual dismissal, that he was not that person. The time had come to find someone who was. The idea had been growing in my mind since I'd read Margaret's journal, but it took form during my weekly visit to the VA clinic for my routine checkup. Dr. Patterson had been monitoring my arthritis and the occasional flare-ups from the old shrapnel wounds, adjustments that came with age, and a body that had absorbed more punishment than it was designed to handle. The waiting room was filled with veterans from different eras. Men my age, who had served in Vietnam, middle-aged guys from the Gulf War, and younger veterans who'd deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. It was always a mixed gathering, but there was an unspoken understanding between us, a recognition that transcended the differences in our uniforms and the decades between our service. I'd been sitting there, reading a magazine article about veteran unemployment, when I overheard a conversation that changed everything. "Jake's been struggling since he got back," a woman was saying to the receptionist. "The prosthetic is working fine, but it's the other stuff, the nightmares, the depression. His family doesn't understand why he can't just get over it and move on with his life." Morrison. The name clicked immediately. This had to be Sarah Morrison, Margaret's friend from years ago. Though she looked older now, worn by worry and the particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love fight battles you can't help them win. I approached her carefully after she'd finished checking Jake in for his appointment. Recognition dawned slowly in her eyes, decades collapsing as she placed my face. "Harris Costa," she said, a smile breaking through the worry lines. "Margaret's husband. I haven't seen you since the funeral," I finished gently. "I remember. You were there. It meant a lot." We found seats together in the waiting area, and she filled me in on Jake's story. He'd enlisted right out of high school, following the path his mother had both feared and respected. 2 tours in Afghanistan, distinguished service, a Bronze Star, for valor. Then an IED had taken his left leg below the knee and sent him home, to a family that expected him to be grateful for surviving, and confused when he struggled with the transition. "They mean well," Sarah said, her voice heavy with the weight of explaining other people's pain. "But they think he should be thankful to be alive and just move forward. They don't understand that part of him died over there. That coming home doesn't automatically make everything okay." I knew that feeling intimately. The disconnect between civilian expectations and military reality. The assumption that surviving was the same as healing. The way people who'd never worn a uniform thought. They understood what service meant. "How's he doing with the prosthetic?" I asked. "Physically, he's adapting well. The VA has been wonderful with the medical side. But emotionally, ... She shrugged helplessly. "He feels like a burden, like his sacrifice doesn't matter, because he couldn't complete his tour. His father thinks he's wallowing, tells him he needs to man up and get back to work. His brother jokes about his robot leg and acts like it's no big deal." The parallels to my own situation were impossible to ignore. Here was another veteran being dismissed by his own family. Another man whose sacrifice was being minimized by people who should have been honoring it. The difference was that Jake Morrison had earned his trauma in the service of his country, while I was being dismissed by someone who'd never risked anything for anyone. "Would you mind if I met him sometime?" I asked. "I know we're from different generations, different wars, but sometimes it helps to talk to someone who understands." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "He would love that. Jake has so much respect for Vietnam veterans, for the way you all came home to protests and criticism, and still managed to build lives. He talks about it sometimes, how unfair that was." We exchanged contact information, and I promised to call the following week to set up a meeting. As I drove home from the clinic, the idea that had been forming in my mind crystallized into a concrete plan. Jake Morrison represented everything Marcus didn't understand about service and sacrifice. He'd put his life on the line for his country, had paid a price that would affect him for the rest of his life, and was now struggling with a family that couldn't appreciate what he'd given up for them. The Purple Heart sitting on my bedroom wall had been earned through sacrifice. But what was the point of sacrifice if it wasn't recognized, if it wasn't valued by the people you'd made it for? Marcus saw it as meaningless metal, but Jake would understand its true worth. He'd earned the right to appreciate what it represented. That evening, I pulled out my old military records, looking for the official documentation that had accompanied my Purple Heart. The citation was there, signed by Colonel Harrison, detailing the actions that had earned me the medal. But there was something else. A letter from the Army explaining the criteria for the award, the regulations governing its presentation. The Purple Heart is awarded to members of the armed forces who have been wounded or killed in action against an enemy of the United States. It's one of the oldest military decorations, dating back to George Washington's badge of military merit. Unlike medals for heroism or achievement, the Purple Heart recognizes sacrifice, the willingness to bleed for your country, to pay a personal price in service of something larger than yourself. Reading those words, I thought about Jake Morrison's missing leg, about the IED that had ended his military career and changed his life forever. He'd earned a Bronze Star for his actions in combat, but regulations prevented him from receiving a Purple Heart, because his injuries had occurred in what was classified as a training accident, rather than direct enemy action, a technicality, a bureaucratic distinction that meant Jake would never receive the recognition that his sacrifice deserved, would never have that tangible symbol of the price he'd paid for his service. But my Purple Heart had been earned through genuine enemy action, through a moment of heroism that had been properly documented and officially recognized. It carried with it the full weight of military tradition and the respect of everyone who understood what it meant. If I gave that medal to Jake, I wouldn't just be giving him a piece of metal. I'd be giving him the recognition his own sacrifice deserved, the symbol of honor that regulations had denied him, the proof that someone understood and valued what he'd given up. Barkis would inherit my house, my savings, my possessions, all the material things that meant nothing compared to the values they represented. But the Purple Heart was different. It wasn't property to be passed down automatically. It was a sacred trust that could only be given to someone worthy of carrying it. I spent the next hour researching veteran support groups in the area, looking for organizations that understood the importance of honoring service and sacrifice. The Veterans of Foreign Wars Post downtown had been holding ceremonies and supporting veterans for decades. They would understand what I was planning to do, would provide the proper setting for such an important moment. The plan was beginning to take shape, a formal ceremony witnessed by men and women who'd served their country, where Jake Morrison would receive the recognition he deserved, and Marcus would learn what it meant to lose something precious because he'd failed to value it. I looked up at the Purple Heart, hanging on my wall, seeing it not as my possession but as a responsibility I'd carried for 46 years. The time had come to pass that responsibility to someone who would honor it, someone who'd earned the right to wear it through sacrifice and service. Jake Morrison had given his leg for his country. That was worth more than all of Marcus's achievements, combined, more valuable than his law degree and his expensive house and his successful practice. Some things couldn't be bought or inherited. Some things had to be earned through blood and sacrifice, and the willingness to put others before yourself. It was time to make sure the Purple Heart ended up where it belonged. I met Jake Morrison on a Tuesday afternoon at the Veteran Resource Center downtown, a modest building that served coffee and provided job placement services for former military personnel. Sarah had arranged the meeting, describing it to Jake as a chance to meet an older veteran who might have some perspective on readjusting to civilian life. He was waiting for me when I arrived, sitting in a corner chair with his back to the wall, an old habit that every combat veteran would recognize. At 31, Jake had the lean build of a career soldier, though there was something in his posture that spoke of defeat, of a man who'd been worn down by circumstances beyond his control. His prosthetic leg was visible beneath his jeans, a sophisticated piece of technology that probably cost more than my first car, but it was his eyes that caught my attention, intelligent, alert, but carrying a weariness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Mr. Costa. He stood to shake my hand, his grip firm and confident, despite the uncertainty in his voice. Mom said you served in Vietnam. Thank you for your service. The automatic courtesy touched me more than he could have known. Here was a man who'd lost his leg in Afghanistan, struggling with his own battles, and his first instinct was to honor someone else's sacrifice. Thank you for yours, I replied, meaning it completely. And please, call me Harris. We're brothers, in arms, regardless of the years between us. We settled into chairs near the window, and I studied Jake Morrison as he told me his story. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 8 years of active duty, a Bronze Star, earned 4 actions that sounded remarkably similar to the incident that had earned me my Purple Heart, rushing into danger to save fellow soldiers, putting mission and brotherhood ahead of personal safety. The IED that had taken his leg had been particularly cruel in its timing. Jake had been scheduled to rotate home the following week, his military career coming to a natural end as he prepared to transition to civilian life. Instead, he'd found himself in a German military hospital, learning to walk again while trying to process the sudden end of everything he'd planned for his future. The hardest part isn't the leg, he said quietly, unconsciously rubbing his thigh where the prosthetic attached. I can handle the physical limitations. the adjustments. It's the way people look at me now, like I'm broken, like I'm something to be pitied rather than respected. I nodded, remembering my own struggles with coming home to a country that didn't understand what we'd been through. What do your family and friends say? Jake's laugh was bitter. My dad thinks I should be grateful to be alive and stop dwelling on the past. My brother makes jokes about my peg leg and tells people I'm lucky to get disabled veteran benefits. My ex-girlfriend said she couldn't handle dating someone who was damaged goods. The parallels to my own situation were striking, though the details were different. Both of us had sacrificed for something larger than ourselves. Both of us were being dismissed by people who should have honored our service. Both of us were struggling with the gap between what we'd given and what we'd received in return. What was your MOS? I asked, using the military term for job specialty. 11 Bravo. Infantry. Same as my grandfather, he served in Korea, though he never talked much about it. I think that's where I got the idea that service was important, that some things were worth fighting for. Infantry, the backbone of the army, the men who did the hardest jobs in the most dangerous places. Jake Morrison had been a ground soldier, the kind of person who understood that freedom wasn't free and that someone had to be willing to pay the price. We talked for 2 hours, sharing stories that only other veterans would understand. Jake described the brotherhood of his unit, the way soldiers looked out for each other in ways that civilian relationships could never match. I told him about Vietnam, about Jimmy Rodriguez and the friends I'd lost, about the way combat taught you what really mattered in life. I keep thinking I should be over it by now, Jake said as our conversation wound down. The Army gave me excellent medical care, disability benefits, job training assistance. On paper, I have everything I need to build a new life. But I feel like I lost more than just my leg over there. I lost my sense of purpose, my place in the world. That's normal, I assured him. Coming home is harder than deploying, in some ways. Over there, you knew who you were, what your mission was, why you mattered. Here, people expect you to just blend in and be grateful for the chance to be ordinary. Exactly. His eyes lit up with the recognition of someone who'd found understanding. My dad keeps asking when I'm going to get back to normal, but I don't think I want normal. Normal people don't understand what we've seen, what we've done, what we've lost. Normal feels like giving up. As I drove home that evening, I knew I'd found the right person. Jake Morrison embodied everything that Marcus didn't understand about service and sacrifice. He'd given up his body for his country, had earned his wounds in the service of something larger than himself, and was now struggling with a world that didn't appreciate what he'd given. More importantly, Jake understood the weight of sacrifice in a way that Marcus never would. He'd held dying friends, had carried the responsibility of other people's lives, had made the kind of split-second decisions that reveal character under pressure. He'd earned the right to be honored, even if his own family couldn't see it. The Purple Heart hanging on my bedroom wall had been waiting 46 years for someone worthy to receive it. Someone who'd understand its true meaning, who'd carry its legacy forward with the respect it deserved. I'd found that person in Jake Morrison, and I was ready to pass the torch to hands that would hold it steady. The next morning, I called the VFW post and asked to speak with the commander about organizing a special ceremony. It was time to put my plan into action, time to show both Jake and Marcus what honor really meant. Some gifts could only be given to those who'd earned them. Some recognition could only be bestowed by those who understood its value. And some lessons could only be learned when the cost of ignorance became too high to ignore. The letter to Marcus took me 3 days to write, each draft revealing new layers of hurt and disappointment that I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I wrote it by hand, the way important communications used to be done, using the fountain pen Margaret had given me for our 20th anniversary. Dear Marcus, it began, the formal salutation feeling strange after years of casual conversation and email exchanges. But this wasn't casual. This was the most important letter I'd ever written. To my son, possibly the last one that would matter. By the time you read this, you'll have discovered that my Purple Heart is no longer hanging on my bedroom wall. Before you jump to conclusions about theft or misplacement, let me explain what I've done and why I felt it was necessary. Last Thursday, I presented my Purple Heart to Jake Morrison, a young veteran who lost his leg serving in Afghanistan. The ceremony was held at the VFW post downtown, witnessed by men and women who understand what military service means and what sacrifices deserve. Recognition. I know you're probably angry right now, feeling like I've given away something that should have been yours. But that's exactly the problem. Marcus, you've never understood that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. Honor isn't passed down. Automatically it's carried forward by those who prove themselves worthy of it. Jake Morrison crawled through enemy fire to save his fellow soldiers, just like I did 46 years ago. He gave up his leg for his country, paid a price that will affect him for the rest of his life. He understands what it means to sacrifice for something larger than yourself, to put duty before comfort, to earn respect through service rather than expect it through birthright. You called me a worthless old soldier at Thanksgiving dinner, dismissing 30 years of military service as if it meant nothing. But my service wasn't worthless to Jimmy Rodriguez, whose life I saved in Vietnam. It wasn't worthless to the young soldiers I trained, who came home alive because I taught them how to survive. It wasn't worthless to your mother, who understood that loving a soldier meant sharing him with something larger than family. The Purple Heart represents everything you've never learned to value: sacrifice, courage, the willingness to bleed for others. It belongs with someone who understands its meaning, not someone who sees it as a piece of metal to be inherited without effort. I've tried for years to teach you these lessons, to help you understand that real worth comes from service, not success. But you've chosen instead to build a life based on taking rather than giving, demanding rather than earning, dismissing what you don't understand rather than trying to learn. Maybe losing something you always assumed would be yours will finally teach you what value really means. Maybe understanding that respect must be earned will help you become the man your mother and I hoped you would be. I don't expect you to understand this decision right now, but someday, when you're older and hopefully wiser, you might realize that the greatest gift a father can give his son isn't an inheritance. It's the lesson that some things are too important to be given away lightly. Your father, Harris Costa, sealed the letter in an envelope and set it aside, knowing I'd give it to Marcus after the ceremony, when the transfer was complete and irreversible. There would be anger, accusations, probably threats of legal action. But Marcus needed to understand that his words had consequences, that dismissing someone's life work came with a price. The conversation with VFW Post Commander Bill Henderson had gone better than I'd hoped. Bill was a Vietnam veteran himself, a former Marine who'd served 2 tours and understood the weight of military honors. When I'd explained what I wanted to do and why, his weathered face had broken into a grin of approval. About time someone taught these kids what sacrifice means, he'd said, leaning back in his chair behind a desk covered with veteran advocacy paperwork. We get too many young guys in here whose families treat their service like a phase they went through instead of the most important thing they ever did. We'd scheduled the ceremony for the following Saturday afternoon, giving me time to make the proper arrangements and invite the right witnesses. Bill would conduct the formal presentation, ensuring that Jake received the recognition with the dignity and respect it deserved. We'll do this right, Bill had promised. Full honor guard, proper protocol, the whole ceremony. That boy will know he's being honored by people who understand what he's given. I'd called Sarah Morrison to discuss the plan, being careful not to reveal too much detail, while ensuring that Jake would be available for what I described as a special recognition ceremony. She'd been thrilled, assuming it was some kind of VA program designed to honor wounded veterans. Jake has been so much better since he met you, she'd told me. Having someone who understands what he's been through, it's made such a difference. He actually smiled yesterday, really smiled, for the first time since he came home. The guest list was small but meaningful. Bill Henderson and his honor guard from the VFW, Sarah Morrison and her husband, a few other veterans I'd met through the VA clinic. Men who'd served in different wars, but shared the common understanding of what military service meant. I hadn't invited Marcus. That decision had been deliberate and painful, but necessary. This ceremony wasn't about punishment or revenge, it was about recognition and honor. Marcus's presence would have contaminated that, would have turned a sacred moment into a family argument. He'd find out afterward, when he discovered the empty space on my bedroom wall and read the letter I'd leave for him. The shock and anger would be intense. But maybe that's what it would take to finally get his attention, to make him understand that his father wasn't the weak, forgettable figure he'd imagined. The Purple Heart sat in its presentation case on my kitchen table, gleaming under the overhead light as I prepared for Saturday's ceremony. I'd cleaned and polished it until it shone like new, wanting it to look perfect for its new recipient. Looking at it now, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in what it represented, sadness at giving it up, but also a deep satisfaction in knowing it was going to someone who would honor it properly. Jake Morrison would understand its weight, would carry its legacy forward with the respect it deserved. Margaret's photo watched from the mantelpiece, and I found myself talking to her, as I often did in the quiet moments when loneliness threatened to overwhelm me. I hope I'm doing the right thing, I said aloud, feeling slightly foolish, but needing to voice my doubts. I know you loved Marcus, believed he could change. But some lessons can only be learned through loss, and maybe this is the lesson he needs. Imagined her voice in response, gentle but firm. You've tried love, and patience, and understanding. Sometimes tough love is the only love that works. The ceremony was set. The guest list was confirmed. The letter was written, and waiting. All that remained was to follow through, to take the action that would change everything between Marcus and me forever. For the first time in years, I felt like the man I'd been in Vietnam, decisive, principled, willing to do the hard thing when it needed to be done. Jake Morrison deserved recognition for his sacrifice. Marcus needed to learn that respect was earned, not inherited. And I needed to prove to myself that I was still a man who stood up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. Saturday couldn't come soon enough. Saturday afternoon arrived cold and clear, the kind of December day that made everything sharp and bright. I dressed carefully in my dress uniform, the one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral and hadn't touched since. The ribbons and badges felt heavier than I remembered, weighted with decades of service and memory. The VFW post was a modest building on the edge of downtown, but it had been transformed for the occasion. Bill Henderson and his volunteers had set up a proper ceremony space with flags and bunting, chairs arranged in neat rows facing a small podium. The American flag hung beside the POW MIA flag, both illuminated by afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. Jake arrived with his mother and stepfather, clearly puzzled by the formal nature of the gathering but dressed in his own service uniform. The Bronze Star was pinned to his chest, earned through the same kind of heroism that had earned me my Purple Heart decades earlier. Seeing him in uniform, standing tall despite the prosthetic leg hidden beneath his dress blues, I knew I'd made the right decision. "Harris, what's all this about?" Sarah whispered, as they took their seats in the front row. "Recognition that's long overdue," I replied, squeezing her shoulder gently. Bill Henderson called the ceremony to order with the crisp authority of a career Marine. The honor guard presented the colors with precision that would have made any drill sergeant proud, and we began with the Pledge of Allegiance and a moment of silence for fallen comrades. "Ladies and gentlemen," Bill announced, his voice carrying the weight of ceremonial tradition, "we gather today to witness an act of recognition and honor. Sergeant Major Harris Costa, United States Army, retired, has requested the privilege of presenting his Purple Heart to Sergeant Jake Morrison, United States Army, in recognition of Sergeant Morrison's service and sacrifice in Afghanistan." Jake's eyes widened in shock, and he started to rise from his chair. I gestured for him to remain seated. This moment belonged to him, but the explanation belonged to me. I approached the podium slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. These were my people, veterans who understood what military service meant, who recognized the significance of what was about to happen. 46 years ago, I began, my voice steady, despite the emotion building in my chest. I was presented with this Purple Heart in a German military hospital. I'd been wounded while saving a fellow soldier's life in Vietnam, and the medal was meant to recognize that sacrifice. For nearly 5 decades, that medal has hung on my bedroom wall, a reminder of the day I learned what it really means to serve something larger than yourself. But medals aren't meant to collect dust, they're meant to honor the values they represent. Jake Morrison embodies those values. He served 2 tours in Afghanistan with distinction, earned a Bronze Star for heroism, under fire, and lost his leg, defending the freedom that we all too often take for granted. He understands what it means to sacrifice for others, to put duty before comfort, to earn respect through service, rather than demand it through birthright. I paused, looking directly at Jake, seeing the tears forming in his eyes as he began to understand what was happening. Military regulations prevented Jake from receiving a Purple Heart for his wounds, but bureaucratic technicalities don't diminish the reality of his sacrifice. He bled for his country, just as surely as I did, paid a price that will affect him for the rest of his life, just as mine has affected me. The Purple Heart represents more than individual achievement. It represents a covenant between those who serve and those who benefit from that service. It reminds us that freedom isn't free, that someone must be willing to pay the price for the security and liberty we enjoy. Today, I pass that covenant to someone who has proven himself worthy of carrying it forward. I opened the presentation case, revealing the Purple Heart in all its symbolic glory. The purple ribbon seemed to glow in the afternoon light, the gold heart with Washington's profile catching the illumination from the window's dot. Jake stood slowly, his composure finally cracking as the full weight of the moment hit him. He approached the podium with the measured stride of a soldier, despite the prosthetic leg that marked his sacrifice. "Sergeant Jake Morrison," I said formally, "for your service to the United States of America, for your sacrifice in the defense of freedom, and for your embodiment of the values that make military service a sacred calling, I present you with this Purple Heart. Wear it with pride, knowing that it represents not just your sacrifice, but the sacrifices of all who have bled in service to something greater than themselves." I pinned the medal to his uniform, just as Colonel Harrison had pinned it to mine so many years ago. Jake's hands were shaking as he saluted, and I returned the salute with the crisp precision of a career soldier. The room erupted in applause, but it was respectful, reverent, the kind of recognition that military ceremonies demand. Jake turned to face the audience, the Purple Heart now rightfully his, and I saw something in his posture that hadn't been there before. Pride, purpose, the recognition that his sacrifice mattered, that it had been witnessed and honored by people who understood its value. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say, except that this means more to me than you could possibly know. For months, I've felt like my service didn't matter, like my sacrifice was meaningless because I couldn't complete my tour. But being here, being honored by people who understand what service means, it reminds me why I served in the first place." He paused, gathering himself. "This medal belongs to every soldier who didn't make it home, every veteran who struggles with invisible wounds, every family member who shares the burden of military service. I'll wear it not just for myself, but for all of us who believe that some things are worth fighting for." After the formal ceremony ended, Jake pulled me aside, the Purple Heart still gleaming on his chest. "Harris, I can't accept this," he said, quietly. "This is your medal, earned with your blood. It should stay in your family." I thought about Marcus, about the cruel words that had led to this moment, about the lesson that needed to be learned. "Jake," I said firmly, "family isn't just about blood. It's about shared values, mutual respect, understanding what really matters. You're more my brother than some people who share my DNA." He searched my eyes, understanding passing between us without the need for further explanation. "Then, I'll honor it," he said simply. "I'll make sure it represents everything you want it to represent." As the gathering dispersed and Jake posed for photos with the other veterans, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. The Purple Heart was where it belonged now, with someone who would understand its weight and carry its legacy forward with honor. Tomorrow, Marcus would discover what I'd done. Tomorrow, there would be anger and accusations, and possibly the end of our relationship entirely. But today, I'd done something right. Today, I'd honored the values that had guided my entire life, even when it cost me something precious. Some things were more important than family harmony. Some lessons could only be taught through loss, and some recognition could only be given to those who'd truly earned it. Marcus arrived at my house on Sunday afternoon, unannounced as usual, letting himself in with the spare key I'd given him years ago. I was in the kitchen, washing the coffee cup from my solitary breakfast, when I heard his footsteps on the stairs. He'd always been drawn to my bedroom, fascinated by the military memorabilia that covered the walls. As a child, he'd spent hours examining the photographs and certificates, asking questions about the uniforms and medals. I'd thought those moments meant something, that he was developing an appreciation for military service and sacrifice. Now, I understood that his interest had been purely acquisitive. He'd been cataloging his future inheritance, estimating the value of items he assumed would eventually be his. The silence from upstairs stretched longer than usual. Then I heard his footsteps again, faster this time, taking the stairs to a time, Dad. His voice carried an edge of panic as he burst into the kitchen. "Where is it? Where's your Purple Heart?" I dried my hands carefully on the dish towel, taking my time before turning to face him. He stood in the doorway, his expensive suit wrinkled from the drive, his face flushed with the kind of agitation that comes from discovering something valuable. "Is missing." "It's not missing," I said calmly. "I gave it to someone who deserved it." The words hit him like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. "You gave it away." "Dad, that medal is worth thousands of dollars. It's a family heirloom. You can't just what?" I interrupted, my voice remaining steady despite the anger building in my chest. "Can't decide what to do with something I earned with my own blood. Can't choose who receives recognition for understanding what sacrifice means." Marcus ran his hands through his hair, the way he used to do as a teenager when he was caught in a lie or facing consequences for his actions. "This is insane. You're not thinking clearly. Who did you give it to?" We can get it back. We can explain that you're having some kind of episode. Episode. The word came out sharper than I'd intended. You think I'm having an episode because I chose to honor someone who actually understands what military service means. I walked to the kitchen table and picked up the letter I'd written, handing it to Marcus with the same deliberate precision I'd once used for important military documents. Read this, I said. It explains everything you need to know. He tore open the envelope with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the pages quickly at first, then slowing as the full implications of what I'd done began to sink in. I watched his face change as he read confusion giving way to shock, shock giving way to anger, anger hardening into something cold and calculating. Jake Morrison, he said finally, crumpling the letter in his fist. Some stranger gets my inheritance, because you've decided to play favorites with homeless veterans. Jake Morrison is not homeless, I corrected quietly. He's a decorated combat veteran who lost his leg serving his country. He understands what that Purple Heart represents, because he earned the right to understand it through his own sacrifice. His sacrifice. Marcus's voice rose to a shout. What about my sacrifice? What about growing up with a father who was never around, who cared more about his army buddies than his own family? What about the birthdays you missed, the games you weren't at, the graduation you almost skipped because of some training exercise, the accusations hung in the air between us, years of resentment finally given voice? I'd expected this, the attempt to turn his disrespect into my failure, his entitlement into justified grievance. You're right, I said simply. I wasn't always there. Military service requires sacrifice from the whole family, not just the soldier. But that doesn't excuse calling your father worthless, Marcus. That doesn't justify dismissing 30 years of honorable service as meaningless. I was angry, he said, his voice slightly less certain now. People say things when they're angry. You know, I didn't mean yes, you did. The words cut through his attempted explanation with the finality of a door slamming shut. You meant every word. You've been thinking it for years, haven't you? That your old man was just a simple soldier who never amounted to anything important, who embarrassed you with his working-class background and his stories about people you've never bothered to understand. Marcus's face flushed red, caught between denial and the uncomfortable recognition of truth. That's not why. Never said I was embarrassed. You didn't have to say it. I could see it in your eyes every time I tried to share something about my service. Every time I talked about the men I'd served with. Every time I suggested that maybe there were more important things in life than money and status. I moved to the kitchen counter, putting some distance between us before continuing. The Purple Heart isn't going to someone random, Marcus. It's going to someone who's earned the right to receive it. Someone who understands that honor isn't achieved through service and sacrifice. Service and sacrifice, he repeated mockingly. You sound like a recruitment poster, Dad. Wake up. Your war was 50 years ago. Nobody cares about Vietnam anymore. Nobody cares about your heroic little stories, or your sacred brotherhood of soldiers. Each word was chosen deliberately, designed to wound. But instead of pain, I felt something close to relief. Finally, we were being honest with each other. The pretense of family affection was stripped away, revealing the contempt that had been festering beneath the surface for years. You're right about one thing, I said quietly. Nobody cares about Vietnam anymore. Most people have forgotten that we ever fought there, forgotten the men who died there, forgotten the sacrifices that were made. But some of us remember, Marcus, some of us understand that forgetting is a betrayal of everyone who served. I walked to the window, looking out at the street where other families were probably enjoying peaceful Sunday afternoons together. Jake Morrison cares. He understands what it means to bleed for something larger than yourself, to carry wounds that never fully heal, to come home to people who don't appreciate what you've given up for them. This is ridiculous, Marcus said, pulling out his phone. I'm calling my lawyer. You can't just give away family property because you're having some kind of crisis. That medal belongs to me, and I'm going to get it back. I turned to face him, seeing not my son, but a stranger wearing my son's face. Someone who valued possession over principle, inheritance over integrity. Good luck with that, I said calmly. The Purple Heart was mine to give, earned through my service and sacrifice. No court is going to force a combat veteran to return recognition to someone who's never earned anything through service. Marcus's phone was already at his ear, his voice taking on the aggressive tone he probably used with opposing counsel. Steve, it's Harris Costa. I need you to look into something for me. My father has given away valuable military property that should be part of his estate, and I want to know what our options are for recovery. I listened to him describe the situation in terms that made me sound senile, and Jake sound like a predator who'd taken advantage of an old man's confusion. The distortion of truth was so complete that I almost admired its thoroughness. When he finished the call, Marcus looked at me with the cold satisfaction of someone who was used to getting his way through intimidation and legal pressure. Steve says we have grounds for a competency hearing if you're making irrational financial decisions. He can file papers to have you declared mentally incompetent and get a court order to reverse any gifts you've made. Is that what you want, Marcus? I asked quietly. To have your father declared mentally incompetent because he chose to honor a fellow veteran, to drag our family through a public legal battle over a medal you've never understood or respected. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, doubt, perhaps, or the last vestige of the love he'd once felt for me. But it was quickly replaced by the hard certainty of someone who'd convinced himself that being right was more important than being decent. I want what's mine, he said simply. That medal represents my inheritance, my family history. You had no right to give it to some stranger just because you're angry about something I said during an argument. Your family history, I repeated slowly. Tell me, Marcus, what do you know about your family history? What do you know about the day I earned that medal? About the friends I lost? About the sacrifices that made your comfortable life possible? He stared at me blankly, and I realized that despite all my attempts over the years to share those stories, he'd never bothered to listen. Never bothered to understand what his father had experienced in service to his country. I know you got wounded in Vietnam, he said impatiently. I know you were in the hospital, and they gave you a medal. What else is there to know? What else is there to know? In that moment, I understood just how completely I'd failed as a father. How thoroughly I'd been dismissed as a person worth understanding. Everything, I said sadly. There's everything else to know, and you've never cared enough to ask. The silence stretched between us. Years of missed connections and failed communications crystallizing into this single moment of absolute understanding. We were strangers who happened to share DNA. People who'd lived in the same house, but never really known each other. I'm going to get that medal back, Dad, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a closing door. And then we're going to have a serious conversation about your living situation. About whether you're capable of making these kinds of decisions anymore. He left without saying goodbye, the front door slamming behind him with enough force to rattle the windows. I stood in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence he'd left behind, feeling strangely peaceful, despite the threats and ultimatums. For the first time in years, I'd been completely honest with my son. I'd stopped making excuses for his behavior, stopped pretending that his disrespect was just misunderstanding, stopped hoping that love alone could bridge the gap between our values. The Purple Heart was where it belonged now, with someone who would honor it. And if that cost me my relationship with Marcus, if it meant facing a competency hearing and legal battles and family warfare, then that was a price I was willing to pay. Some things were more important than keeping the peace. Some stands were worth taking, regardless of the consequences. I'd made my choice, and I was ready to live with whatever came next. The legal papers arrived 3 days later, delivered by a courier who looked embarrassed to be serving documents to an elderly veteran. The letterhead read Morrison, Klein and Associates, Marcus's firm, though the documents were signed by his partner to avoid the appearance of direct conflict of interest. I read through the legalese slowly. Margaret's reading glasses perched on my nose as I tried to understand the formal language of family betrayal. Petition for competency evaluation. Motion for temporary conservatorship. Request for court order to recover improperly transferred assets. Marcus had moved quickly, efficiently, using the full weight of his legal training to build a case against his own father. The documents painted me as a confused old man suffering from possible dementia, making irrational decisions under the influence of manipulative strangers. Jake Morrison was described as an individual who exploited the petitioner's father's mental confusion for personal gain. The cruelest part was how clinical it all sounded. How the law reduced our relationship to a series of financial transactions and competency assessments. 30 years of military service became previous employment. The Purple Heart became valuable personal property, improperly transferred, without consideration. My phone had been ringing constantly since the papers were served. Jennifer had called, twice, her voice tight with the kind of anger that comes from someone who's discovered their inheritance might be at risk. She'd made it clear that the children wouldn't be visiting until this situation is resolved. Turning my grandchildren into bargaining chips in a war. I'd never wanted to fight. But the call that surprised me most had come from Jake Morrison. Harris I heard about the legal papers, he'd said, his voice heavy with guilt and concern. I never wanted this to cause problems with your family. Maybe I should give the medal back. Absolutely not, I'd interrupted firmly. That medal is yours, earned through your sacrifice and properly given. Don't let legal intimidation change what's right. But if it's causing problems with your son, the problems with my son existed long before you came into the picture. Jake, this isn't about the medal. Not really. It's about respect and values, and the kind of man he's chosen to become. Still, the guilt in Jake's voice had been unmistakable. He was struggling with the weight of being the catalyst for a family's destruction, even though the fault lay entirely with Marcus's response rather than my decision. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving Marcus's team barely a week to build their case for my incompetency. They'd need medical testimony, evidence of irrational behavior, proof that I was no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. I'd already made my first appointment with Dr. Patterson, my longtime VA physician, to request a comprehensive mental health evaluation. If Marcus wanted to question my competency, I'd make sure the court had access to professional assessment rather than the speculation of lawyers who'd never bothered to understand military culture. But the legal maneuvering was only part of the battle. Marcus had also launched a campaign to isolate me from the veteran community that had become my primary source of support and understanding. His investigators had contacted the VFW post, asking questions about the ceremony and whether proper procedures had been followed. They'd implied that I might have been suffering from diminished capacity when I'd made the decision to transfer the medal. Bill Henderson had called to warn me about the inquiries. His Marines' outrage clear even over the phone. They're trying to make it sound like we took advantage of you, he'd said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Like the ceremony was some kind of scam to separate you from valuable property. What did you tell them? The truth, that you were completely lucid, completely in control of your faculties, and completely clear about what you wanted to do and why. That the ceremony was conducted with proper military honors and witnessed by people who understand what military service means. The investigation had extended to other areas of my life as well. Marcus's team had contacted my bank, my insurance company, even my grocery store, looking for evidence of confusion or irrational spending patterns. They'd found nothing. My finances were meticulously organized, my bills paid on time, my investments conservative but sound. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus, who'd borrowed money from me just months earlier without considering my financial situation, was now questioning my ability to manage my own affairs. The most painful part of the entire process was watching how quickly family loyalty crumbled under the pressure of potential financial loss. Jennifer's parents had called, offering their support for Marcus's position and suggesting that perhaps I did need professional guidance in managing my estate. Even distant relatives who'd rarely spoken to me over the years suddenly emerged with opinions about my mental state and concerns, about family property being given to outsiders. Only Sarah Morrison had offered unconditional support, calling to express her outrage at what Marcus was putting me through. I've known you for 40 years, Harris, she'd said, her voice fierce with protective anger. If you're suffering from dementia, then so is every other intelligent person I've ever met. What Marcus is doing is shameful, and I'll testify to that if necessary. The local newspaper had picked up the story, though they'd been careful to present it as a human interest piece about veteran support rather than a family legal battle. The article had generated an unexpected wave of community support, with letters to the editor praising my decision to honor a younger veteran and criticizing the use of legal pressure to overturn acts of military brotherhood. But the most telling response had come from Jimmy, Rodriguez's daughter in El Paso. She'd somehow heard about the situation and called to offer her support. Her voice choked with emotion as she explained what my father's sacrifice had meant to her family. My dad talked about you until the day he died, she'd said. He said you saved his life in Vietnam, gave him the chance to come home and raise his family. If you think Jake Morrison deserves that medal, then he deserves it. And anyone who says different doesn't understand what real honor means. The irony was devastating. Strangers who'd never met me understood the significance of what I'd done, while my own son saw it only as theft of his inheritance. As I sat in my kitchen that evening, surrounded by legal documents and case notes, I found myself thinking about Margaret and what she would have made of this situation. She'd always believed in the power of love to overcome any obstacle, always insisted that family bonds were stronger than temporary disagreements. But she'd also believed in standing up for what was right, regardless of the personal cost. She'd married a soldier knowing that his commitment to duty might sometimes put him at odds with conventional family expectations. The Purple Heart was with Jake Morrison now, displayed with honor in a place where it would be appreciated and understood. That was what mattered, regardless of what the courts ultimately decided about my competency or my right to make such decisions. Some battles were worth fighting, even when the enemy was your own blood. Some principles were worth defending, even when the cost was everything you'd thought you could count on. The legal war would continue, but I'd already won the only victory that mattered. I'd honored a fellow veteran's sacrifice and reminded myself that I was still a man who stood up for what was right. Whatever Marcus's lawyers threw at me next, I was ready. The story broke in the local newspaper on Thursday morning, though not in the way Marcus had probably hoped. Instead of portraying me as a confused old man being taken advantage of, reporter Linda Chen had written a piece titled, "Local Veteran Honors Afghanistan War Hero with Purple Heart Transfer." The article included a photo from the ceremony, Jake Morrison in his dress uniform, the Purple Heart gleaming on his chest, standing beside me, and Bill Henderson. We looked like what we were, 3 generations of American veterans, bound together by shared understanding of service and sacrifice. In an age when military service is often overlooked or taken for granted, Chen had written, Sergeant Major Harris Costa's decision to transfer his Purple Heart to wounded Afghanistan veteran Jake Morrison represents the best traditions of military brotherhood and honor. She'd interviewed Jake extensively, and his quotes revealed the depth of what the recognition meant to him. "When I lost my leg, I felt like I'd lost my identity as a soldier," Jake had told her. "Coming home to a family that didn't understand what I'd been through made it worse. But Sergeant Major Costa saw something in me that I'd lost sight of myself. He reminded me that sacrifice has meaning, that service matters, that the brotherhood of veterans extends across generations." The newspaper had also contacted several military historians and veteran advocates, all of whom praised the transfer as an appropriate recognition of Jake's service and sacrifice. Dr. Michael Patterson, a professor of military history at the State University, had provided context for the decision. "The Purple Heart has always been more than just individual recognition," Patterson had explained. "It represents a continuum of sacrifice, a reminder that freedom requires constant vigilance, and that some people are willing to pay the ultimate price for that freedom." Sergeant Major Costa's decision to pass his medal to a younger veteran who embodies those same values is entirely consistent with the spirit of the award. The article had sparked an immediate response from the veteran community. By noon on Thursday, my phone was ringing constantly with calls of support from people I'd never met, but who understood what I'd done and why it mattered. Tom Bradley, a Gulf War veteran who ran a local construction company, called to offer his support for any legal expenses I might face. "What you did was exactly right," he'd said, his voice rough with emotion. "Too many of us come home to families who think we should just forget what we've seen and move on." He showed that young man that his service matters, and that's worth more than any amount of money. Maria Santos, whose son had been killed in Iraq, called to thank me for honoring veterans who'd been forgotten by their own families. "My boy died for this country, and his father thinks I should get over it and stop talking about his service," she'd said through tears. "People like you keep their memory alive, keep their sacrifice from being meaningless." The VFW post had been flooded with calls and visits from veterans wanting to show their support. Bill Henderson told me that membership applications had doubled in the past week, as younger veterans sought out an organization that understood the importance of military brotherhood. But the most meaningful support had come from an unexpected source at the Purple Heart recipients who'd heard about the situation and wanted to express their solidarity. Colonel James Morrison, no relation to Jake, had driven 3 hours from the state capital to meet with me personally. A Vietnam veteran like myself, he'd been awarded the Purple Heart after losing his arm in a rocket attack near Da Nang. "What you've done takes real courage," he'd told me as we sat in my living room, sharing coffee and war stories. "It would have been easy to keep that medal, to pass it down automatically to your son, but you understood that it represents something larger than family. Inheritance, it represents values that have to be earned, not inherited." Colonel Morrison had offered to testify on my behalf if the competency hearing proceeded, as had several other Purple Heart recipients who'd contacted me through veteran organizations. The idea that Marcus might succeed in having me declared incompetent was becoming increasingly unlikely as the veteran community rallied to my defense. The story had also reached social media, where it had been shared thousands of times by veteran groups and military families. The overwhelming response had been positive. with comments praising my decision and criticizing Marcus's legal response. "This is what honor looks like," read one typical comment. "An old soldier who understands that some things are more important than money or inheritance. Anyone who tries to take that medal away from Jake Morrison doesn't understand what military service means." Read another. The negative comments were telling in their focus. They came primarily from people who saw the Purple Heart only in terms of monetary value, who couldn't understand why someone would give away something worth thousands of dollars to a stranger. But those comments were vastly outnumbered by messages of support from military families who understood exactly what I'd done and why it mattered. Local television station had picked up the story as well, interviewing both Jake and me about the ceremony and its aftermath. Jake had been particularly eloquent in explaining what the recognition meant to him. "Sergeant Major Costa didn't just give me a medal," he'd said, looking directly into the camera. "He gave me back my sense of purpose, my understanding that what I'd sacrificed in Afghanistan had meaning. When your own family tells you to get over losing your leg in service to your country, having someone like Harris Costa say that your sacrifice matters, that changes everything." The interviewer had asked me about Marcus's legal challenge, and I'd chosen my words carefully. "I understand that my son is upset about my decision," I'd said, "but the Purple Heart isn't property to be inherited, it's recognition that must be earned. Jake Morrison earned the right to wear that medal through his service and sacrifice, and no court ruling can change that fact." The interview had aired on the evening news, and the station's website had been flooded with supportive comments. Several local businesses had reached out to offer Jake employment, understanding that his military experience and demonstrated character made him exactly the kind of employee they wanted. More importantly, other veteran families had contacted Jake to offer friendship and support. He'd found himself part of a community he hadn't known existed, people who understood what he'd been through, who valued his service, who saw his wound as a badge of honor rather than a source of pity. Sarah Morrison had called to tell me that Jake was like a different person since the ceremony. "He's started volunteering at the VA clinic," she'd said, her voice bright with maternal pride. "He's helping other amputees adjust to their prosthetics, sharing his story with veterans who are struggling with depression and family rejection. You didn't just give him a medal, Harris, you gave him back his life." The community support had been overwhelming and heartwarming, but it had also hardened my resolve to fight Marcus's legal challenge. Too many people understood what I'd done, and why it mattered for me to back down now. The Purple Heart belonged with Jake Morrison, and I was prepared to defend that decision with every resource at my disposal. The preliminary hearing was still scheduled for Monday, but I was no longer facing it alone. The veteran community had rallied to my defense, offering everything from character witnesses to legal support to simple moral encouragement. Marcus might have the law on his side, but I had something more powerful, the recognition that I'd done the right thing for the right reasons, supported by people who understood what military service really meant. Some battles were worth fighting, especially when you weren't fighting them alone. The confrontation I'd been expecting finally came on Friday afternoon, but not in the way I'd anticipated. Instead of lawyers or legal papers, it was Jake Morrison who appeared at my door, his face grim with determination and something that looked like barely controlled anger. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, stepping into my living room and turning to face me with the rigid posture of a soldier preparing for combat. I'd expected this moment eventually, the point where the pressure from Marcus's legal campaign became too much for Jake to bear, where the guilt of being the catalyst for a family's destruction overwhelmed his appreciation for the honor I'd bestowed. "If you've come to return the medal," I began, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. "I haven't come to return anything," he said firmly. "I've come to tell you what happened when your son showed up at my apartment this morning." The words hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had sought out Jake directly, bypassing lawyers and legal procedures to confront the man he saw as the thief of his inheritance. "He came to your home with his wife and some guy in an expensive suit, who I'm guessing was another lawyer," Jake said, his military bearing evident in the way he stood at attention, despite his artificial leg. "They wanted to make me an offer." I felt my hands clench into fists, remembering other times when Marcus had tried to solve problems with money, rather than addressing the underlying issues. "What kind of offer?" $50,000 to give back the Purple Heart and sign something saying I'd taken advantage of a mentally incompetent veteran. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless, but I could see the anger burning in his eyes. "They said it would be easier for everyone if I just took the money and walked away, that fighting it in court would be expensive and embarrassing for me. The casual arrogance of the approach was so typically Marcus that I felt a familiar mix of disappointment and rage. He'd tried to buy his way out of the consequences of his disrespect, to reduce Jake's sacrifice to a financial transaction. What did you tell them? I told them to get the hell out of my apartment before I called the police. Jake's composure cracked slightly, revealing the depth of his outrage. But that's not the worst part. Harris, your son, your own flesh and blood, looked me in the eye and said that I was nothing but a broken soldier trying to steal from old men who didn't know better. The words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. Marcus had used the same dismissive language about Jake that he'd used about me, reducing both of us to pathetic figures worthy of nothing but contempt. He said that, I asked quietly, though I wasn't really surprised. The boy who'd called his father worthless would have no problem extending that cruelty to a stranger. He said a lot more than that, Jake continued, his voice growing stronger as he worked through his anger. He said that real men don't get their legs blown off because they're too stupid to avoid roadside bombs. He said that anyone who gets fooled into thinking military service matters is living in the past and needs to grow up and face reality. Each revelation was worse than the last, painting a picture of a man so consumed by entitlement and greed that he'd attack a wounded veteran to get what he wanted. But here's the thing that really got to me, Jake said, stepping closer and looking me directly in the eyes. He said that you were a bitter old man who'd never accomplished anything important, who was trying to live vicariously through younger veterans because your own military career had been meaningless. The final insult hung in the air between us, and I understood why Jake had come here with such determination. Marcus hadn't just attacked him, he'd attacked everything I represented. Everything the Purple Heart symbolized. Everything that military service stood for. I've been struggling with guilt since this whole legal thing started, Jake admitted, his shoulders sagging slightly as the adrenaline of anger gave way to something deeper. Wondering if I should give back the medal to preserve your relationship with your family, thinking that maybe blood was thicker than principle. He paused, gathering himself before continuing. But after meeting your son, after seeing what kind of man he really is, I understand something I didn't before. This isn't about a medal, and it isn't about inheritance. It's about whether the values that military service represents honor sacrifice. Respect for those who've paid the price, whether those values matter more than money and comfort and easy answers. Jake straightened to his full height, and for a moment I could see the soldier he'd been before the IED had changed his life. Your son thinks we're both pathetic relics of wars that don't matter anymore. He thinks our wounds are signs of weakness. Our service is signs of stupidity. Our brotherhood is signs of desperation. He offered me $50,000 because he thinks that's all my principles are worth. And what did you tell him? I asked, though I could already see the answer in his eyes. I told him that there isn't enough money in the world to make me give up the only recognition I've ever received that acknowledged my sacrifice as honorable rather than tragic. I told him that you're worth 10 of him, and that the Purple Heart is exactly where it belongs, with someone who understands what it means to bleed for something larger than yourself. The pride I felt in that moment was overwhelming, not just in Jake's response, but in the validation that I'd chosen the right person to receive the medal. He'd faced the test of Marcus's corrupting offer and proven himself worthy of the honor I'd bestowed. There's something else, Jake continued, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small digital recorder. I recorded the whole conversation, everything he said about you, about me, about military service in general. I thought you should hear it, should know exactly what kind of man your son has become. He offered me the recorder, but I waved it away. I didn't need to hear Marcus's words to understand what kind of person he'd revealed himself to be. The fact that he'd tried to bribe Jake, that he'd attacked a wounded veteran to get what he wanted, told me everything I needed to know. Keep the recording, I said quietly. If the legal proceedings continue, it might be useful evidence of his true character. There's one more thing, Jake said, hesitating for the first time since he'd arrived. Your son said something else, something that I think you need to hear. I braced myself for another revelation, another example of Marcus's cruelty. He said that once this legal mess was over, once he'd gotten the medal back and dealt with your competency issues, he was planning to put you in a nursing home. Said it would be easier than dealing with your military obsession and your inappropriate relationships with strangers. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place, revealing the full scope of Marcus's plan. This wasn't just about the Purple Heart, it was about control, about removing me from any position where I could make decisions he disagreed with. But instead of fear or despair, I felt something close to relief. The pretense was finally over. The son I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for had revealed himself to be someone who saw his father as nothing more than an obstacle to his own comfort and convenience. "Thank you for telling me," I said simply. "And thank you for refusing his offer. It means more than you could possibly know." Jake nodded, the tension leaving his shoulders as he completed his mission. "The medal stays where it is," he said firmly. "No matter what lawyers or courts or family pressure tries to change that. You gave it to me because you saw something in me that I'd lost sight of myself. I'm not giving up that recognition for any amount of money or to appease any amount of family dysfunction." After Jake left, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing everything he'd told me. Marcus had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had revealed a character so fundamentally flawed that no amount of fatherly love could repair it. The boy who'd played with toy soldiers in this very room had grown into a man who saw real soldiers as beneath his contempt. The son I'd hoped to make proud had become someone whose approval I no longer wanted. But Jake Morrison had reminded me of something important, that the values I'd tried to pass on weren't lost. They'd just found their way to someone more worthy of carrying them forward. The Purple Heart was in the right hands, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I was completely at peace with my decision. The phone call came at 6:30 on Monday morning, 30 minutes before I was supposed to leave for the competency hearing. It was Marcus, but his voice sounded different, smaller somehow, stripped of the aggressive confidence that had characterized our recent conversations. "Dad, we need to talk before the hearing." "I thought your lawyers did your talking for you now," I replied, not bothering to hide the bitterness in my voice. "Please, just can I come over? There's something I need to say." Against my better judgment, I agreed. 20 minutes later, Marcus stood on my doorstep looking like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion or tears. "I listened to the recording," he said without preamble as he stepped into the living room. It took me a moment to understand what he meant. Jake must have given him a copy of their conversation, forced him to confront his own words and the ugliness they revealed. And Marcus sank into Margaret's old chair, the one where she used to sit and read while I watched television. He looked lost in it, diminished by the weight of whatever had brought him here. I heard myself saying things. He stopped, running his hands through his hair, in the gesture I remembered from his childhood. "Dad, I said terrible things about you, about Jake, about people who've sacrificed everything for this country." I remained standing, unwilling to make this conversation comfortable for him. He'd come here for absolution, but forgiveness would have to be earned, not given freely. "You said what you believed," I replied quietly. The recording just made it impossible to pretend otherwise. "That's just it. I don't think I did believe those things. Not really. I was angry about the medal, frustrated that you'd made a decision without consulting me, worried about what it meant for my inheritance. So I said the cruelest things I could think of, the things I knew would hurt the most." He looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to apologize for breaking windows with his baseball. When I heard myself on that recording, heard the venom in my voice, the contempt, I didn't recognize the person speaking. That wasn't the man Mum raised. That wasn't the son she was proud of. No, I agreed, it wasn't. The simple acknowledgement seemed to hit him harder than any angry accusation would have. He flinched as if I'd struck him, and I saw tears forming in his eyes. "I called Jake to apologize," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you know what he said? He said that apologies were meaningless without changed behavior, that the only way to make things right was to drop the legal case and publicly acknowledge that you'd acted appropriately." I felt a surge of pride in Jake's response. The young veteran had understood something that Marcus was only beginning to grasp, that words were cheap without actions to back them up. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him he was right." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder of legal documents. "I've already called my lawyer and withdrawn the competency petition. The hearing is cancelled. The investigation is over, and there will be no further legal challenges to your decision." I stared at the papers, hardly believing what I was seeing. After all the threats and legal maneuvering, all the attempts to paint me as incompetent and Jake as manipulative, Marcus was simply walking away. "Why?" I asked. "Because Jake Morrison earned that medal in ways I never could. Because you were right to give it to someone who understands its value. Because I've been a terrible son who confused inheritance with entitlement, and forgot that respect has to be earned." The admission hung in the air between us, honest and painful and long overdue. But words were only the beginning of redemption, and we both knew it. "What happens now?" I asked. Marcus stood slowly, straightening his shoulders, in a gesture that reminded me of the soldier he might have been in different circumstances. Now I try to become the man you and Mom raised me to be. I start by publicly apologizing for my actions, by acknowledging that you acted with complete competency and honor. I explain to Emma and David why their grandfather was right to honor a fellow veteran. And I make sure they understand the difference between earning respect and expecting it. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. And I ask, not demand. Ask if there's any chance you might be willing to let me try to rebuild our relationship. Not as your heir who's entitled to your approval, but as your son who wants to earn your respect. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or calculation, but saw only genuine remorse and a desperate hope for redemption. This was still Marcus, still the boy who'd disappointed me countless times before. But there was something different in his expression, a humility that hadn't been there before. It would take time, I said carefully. Years, probably, and it would require more than apologies. It would require fundamental changes in how you see the world, how you treat people, how you value things that can't be bought or inherited. I understand, he said quietly. I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness. I'm asking for the chance to prove that I can change, that I can become someone worthy of being your son. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I allowed myself to hope that the boy I'd raised might still exist somewhere inside the man who'd disappointed me so deeply. The Purple Heart stays with Jake, I said firmly. That's non-negotiable. I know, and it should stay with him. He's earned it in ways I never have. I gestured toward the couch, and Marcus sat down carefully, as if afraid that any sudden movement might shatter this fragile moment of reconciliation. Tell me about Jake, I said. What did you really think of him when you met him? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. I thought he was everything I'm not, he admitted finally. Brave, selfless, committed to something larger than himself. When I looked at him, I saw what you must have been like at his age, someone who understood that some things are worth fighting for, worth bleeding for. The comparison surprised me. I'd never thought Marcus saw me that way, had assumed he viewed my military service as an embarrassment rather than something to admire. I spent so many years being angry at you for choosing the army over family, he continued. But seeing Jake, listening to his stories about Afghanistan, I finally understood something I'd been too selfish to grasp before. What's that? You didn't choose the army over us. You chose to serve something that protected us, that made our comfortable lives possible. The freedom I took for granted. The security I never questioned that came from people like you and Jake being willing to pay a price I was never asked to pay. He paused, struggling with emotions he'd never expressed before. When I offered Jake money to give back the medal, I was treating your sacrifice like a commodity, something that could be bought and sold. But that's not what it is it? Proof that you were willing to bleed for strangers, to risk everything for people you'd never meet. That's what service means, I said quietly. Understanding that some things are bigger than yourself, that your comfort and safety depend on other people's willingness to sacrifice. I want to learn that, Marcus said urgently. I want to understand what you tried to teach me all those years ago. I want to be someone Emma and David can be proud of. Someone who serves others instead of just serving himself. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable, but change would require more than good intentions. It would require sustained effort, uncomfortable growth, the kind of difficult personal transformation that most people avoided. It won't be easy, I warned him. Learning to put others first, when you've spent 42 years putting yourself first, that's harder than any military training I ever went through. I know, but I have to try. Jake Morrison shamed me into seeing what I'd become, and I don't like that person. I want to become someone better, someone worthy of being Margaret Costa's son and Harris Costa's boy. The mention of Margaret's name brought tears to my eyes. She'd believed in Marcus until the end, had faith that love could overcome any obstacle. Maybe she'd been right after all. Maybe this crisis had been what he needed to finally grow into the man she'd always believed he could become. There's something you should know, I said slowly. Jake has been volunteering at the VA clinic, helping other amputees adjust to their prosthetics. He's found purpose in service, in helping people who are struggling with the same challenges he's faced. Marcus nodded, understanding the implicit lesson. I want to do something like that, he said. Use my legal skills to help veterans navigate disability claims, deal with bureaucracy, fight for benefits they've earned. Not as charity, but as service, as a way to honor what people like you and Jake have given. The offer was more than I dared hope for. Marcus wasn't just apologizing, he was proposing to dedicate part of his professional life to serving the veteran community, to put his considerable skills to work helping people who'd served their country. There's a legal aid clinic at the VA, I said carefully. They're always looking for lawyers willing to work pro bono on veteran cases. I'll call them today, Marcus promised. And I'll keep calling until they let me help. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just happened. The son who'd called me worthless was asking for the chance to prove his worth through service to others. Dad, Marcus said finally, his voice hesitant. Would you be willing to introduce me to Jake? Not as the man who tried to steal his medal, but as someone who wants to learn from his example. The request was humble, almost childlike in its vulnerability. After all the legal threats and attempted bribes, Marcus was asking for the simple privilege of meeting the man whose character had shown him his own failings. I'll ask him, I said, but it will be his decision. He doesn't owe you anything, and he has every right to refuse. I understand. But maybe, if he sees that I'm serious about changing, about becoming someone better, maybe he'll give me the chance to prove it. As Marcus prepared to leave, he paused at the door and turned back to me with an expression I hadn't seen since he was a child. I love you, Dad, he said simply. I know I haven't shown it in ways that mattered, but I do. And I'm going to spend whatever time we have left trying to become the son you deserved to have. After he left, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about second chances and the power of humility to transform hearts. The Purple Heart was still with Jake Morrison, where it belonged. But maybe, just maybe, my son had finally learned what it represented. The road to redemption would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, I believed Marcus might be willing to walk it. And that was enough to rebuild hope on. 6 months later, I stood in the same VFW post, where I'd given Jake Morrison my Purple Heart, watching my son address a room full of veterans about the legal services he'd been providing through the VA clinic. The transformation in Marcus had been remarkable, not instant, but steady and genuine, like watching a plant slowly turn toward the sun. When I first met Jake Morrison, Marcus was saying, his voice carrying none of the arrogance that had once defined him, I saw him as an obstacle to what I thought I deserved. I was wrong about almost everything that mattered, but I was especially wrong about what service means and why it's worth honoring. The audience, grizzled veterans from multiple conflicts, listened with the kind of respectful attention they reserved for people who'd proven themselves through actions rather than words. Marcus had earned that respect over months of volunteer work, handling disability appeals and bureaucratic battles with the same intensity he'd once applied to corporate law. Jake Morrison sat in the front row, the Purple Heart visible on his civilian jacket. The medal had become part of his identity, worn not as decoration, but as a reminder of the values it represented. Next to him sat Sarah Morrison, beaming with maternal pride at the man her son had become since receiving recognition for his sacrifice. Behind them, Emma and David listened with the kind of attention children rarely gave adult speeches. They'd been spending more time with me lately, learning about their grandfather's military service and their family's history. Marcus had made sure they understood why the Purple Heart had gone to Jake, had taught them that honor was earned rather than inherited. 6 months ago, my father made a decision that I thought was senile and hurtful, Marcus continued. I tried to use the law to force him to reverse that decision, to get back what I saw as my inheritance. I was thinking like someone who'd never learned the difference between price and value, between ownership and stewardship. The admission was still difficult for him, but he'd learned that growth required uncomfortable honesty about past failures. He'd made similar admissions in newspaper interviews, on local television, and in presentations to veterans groups across the state. What I've learned through working with veterans over these past months is that my father didn't give away my inheritance. He made sure it went to someone who could truly inherit its meaning. Jake Morrison earned that Purple Heart through sacrifice and service, through understanding what it means to put others before yourself. He paused, looking directly at me, where I sat with Margaret's photo in my lap. I'd brought it to every event where Marcus spoke about his transformation, wanting her to witness the redemption of the son she'd never stopped believing in. I want to read you something, Marcus said, pulling out a folded piece of paper. It's from a letter my father wrote to me 6 months ago, explaining why he'd transferred his Purple Heart to Jake Morrison. He began reading from the letter I'd never expected him to share publicly, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. Honor isn't passed down automatically. It's carried forward by those who prove themselves worthy of it. Those words changed my life because they forced me to ask a question I'd never considered. What had I done to prove myself worthy of honoring? My father's service. The answer, Marcus explained, had been humbling. He'd built a successful career, accumulated wealth and status, but he'd never sacrificed anything for anyone else. He'd never put duty before comfort, service before success, others before himself. Working with veterans through the legal clinic has taught me what my father tried to teach me all those years ago, that real worth comes from service, not success. That the measure of a man isn't what he takes from the world, but what he gives back. He went on to describe specific cases he'd handled: a Vietnam veteran finally receiving disability benefits after years of bureaucratic delays, an Iraq war widow getting survivor benefits that had been wrongly denied, a young Marine getting the medical care he needed for PTSD. Each case reminds me that freedom isn't free, that the comfortable life I've enjoyed was paid for by people like Jake Morrison, like my father, like every person in this room who chose to serve something larger than themselves. After the presentation, the audience mingled over coffee and cookies provided by the VFW Auxiliary. I watched Marcus talking intently with a group of younger veterans, listening to their stories with the kind of attention he'd once reserved for wealthy clients. The transformation wasn't complete, probably never would be, but it was genuine. Jake Morrison approached me, moving easily, despite the prosthetic leg that had once seemed like such a devastating loss. "Your son's doing good work," he said, following my gaze to where Marcus was discussing a disability appeal with a former Marine. "He's helped more veterans in 6 months than some advocates help in years. He learned from a good teacher," I replied, meaning both Jake's example and the hard lessons that came from losing something precious. "The Purple Heart looks good on you," I added, noting how naturally Jake wore the medal, how it had become part of his identity rather than just an accessory. "It reminds me every day that sacrifice has meaning," Jake said. "That the leg I lost in Afghanistan wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was part of something larger, something worth the price." Emma and David ran up to us, full of excitement, from listening to their father's presentation and meeting so many real veterans. "Grandpa," Emma said, "Dad says you're a hero because you've saved someone's life in Vietnam, and that you gave your medal to Jake because he's a hero too," David added, looking up at Jake with obvious admiration. I knelt down to their level, wanting to make sure they understood the most important lesson of all. Being a hero isn't about getting medals or being called special, I told them. It's about being willing to help other people, even when it's hard or scary or costs you something important, like Dad helping veterans with their legal problems. Emma asked. "Exactly like that. Your father learned that the best way to honor heroes is to serve others, to use your talents to make life better for people who need help." As the evening wound down, Marcus approached our small group with obvious nervousness. Despite months of progress, he still seemed uncertain around Jake, still carried guilt over their first meeting. "Jake," he said formally, "I wanted to thank you again for what you've taught me. Not just about service, but about character, about what it means to be worthy of respect." Jake studied Marcus for a moment, then extended his hand with a slight smile. "We all make mistakes, Marcus. What matters is what we do after we realize we've made them. You've been doing the right things for the right reasons, and that counts for a lot." The handshake between them symbolized more than forgiveness, represented the completion of a circle that had begun with my decision to honor Jake's sacrifice. Marcus had learned what the Purple Heart really meant, not by inheriting it, but by earning the right to understand its value through service to others. As we prepared to leave, Jake pulled me aside one more time. "I got a letter from Jimmy Rodriguez's daughter," he said, referring to the man whose life I'd saved in Vietnam. "She heard about the medal transfer and wanted me to know that her family supports what you did. She said her father would be proud to know his life was saved by someone who understood that honor belongs with those who earn it." The validation from Jimmy's family meant more than any legal victory or public recognition. It confirmed that the Purple Heart was exactly where it belonged, carrying forward the legacy of sacrifice and service that connected generations of veterans. Driving home that night, I felt the kind of peace that comes from seeing important work completed. The Purple Heart was with someone who understood its weight. My son had learned the difference between inheritance and merit. The veteran community had gained an advocate who fought for them with the passion of someone seeking redemption. Most importantly, Emma and David were growing up with a clearer understanding of what honor meant, what service required, what respect had to be earned rather than expected. Margaret's photo sat on the passenger seat beside me, her smile seeming especially bright in the dashboard light. She'd believed in second chances, in the power of love to transform hearts. in the possibility that even the most difficult lessons could be learned, if someone was willing to teach them with patience and courage. The Purple Heart had found its way to the right hands, carrying with it the legacy of everyone who'd ever bled for something larger than themselves. And sometimes, that was legacy enough.